Morning, everyone. We're going to get started. Sorry, can we get audio on this?
Ani, bonjour. Sarah Rockandishnakas. Shebananing and Donjaba, Takaranto and Day. Takaranto, a Mohawk word. The place in the water where the trees are standing. The place where the fish weirs are. My dog and I spend a lot of time walking. It's my favorite way to move through this city. For me, it's a meditative action that isn't about negotiating bike lanes or public transit, but a time to slow down and really try to see the world around me. Concrete sidewalks, parking lots, now covering the rivers and trails that once flowed freely. The Petun, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Métis, the Mississaugas all made their homes here. And many other nations expanding beyond these groups traveled through for commerce and trade for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. I think of the other First Peoples' languages and the names they had for this place. I think of the ancient trails covered by the pressures of settlement. The waterways and the moderate climate of the Great Lakes made it a perfect place to fish, hunt, grow food, gather medicines and seeds for horticultural development. Rich, fertile, and abundant, Turtle Islands, Mesopotamia. Many First Peoples and their goods traveled from here all the way to the Mississippi and back. Whenever I travel somewhere new, I try to find out whose land I'm on, and I ask, who are the original occupants here? So for Indigenous peoples, land acknowledgements are not only to assert our sovereignty and treaty rights of today, but it's also a way for all peoples to feel more connected to a place. Davenport might be a street now, one I walk down regularly in my neighborhood, but it's not just another thoroughfare. For me, it's an ancient portage trail that holds Indigenous knowledge. They say the animals made the first trails that led them to water, and the people followed. I imagine the deer and the moose once made this trail, followed by the people carrying their birch bark canoes, carrying their goods to trade, and bringing stories to tell. Nations from all over Turtle Island met and traveled through this land. Many languages were spoken. Alliances and decisions were made. People from different nations met and intermarried. The dish with one spoon treaty was made. Takaranto was a meeting place and land made up of sophisticated and cosmopolitan peoples and cultures that I see reflected in the city today. I wonder, is it something in the land and the water? Land acknowledgements might seem like a small and simple gesture, but like many of our ways, they are intended to have more impact and hold more meaning than the words alone. If we pride ourselves on diversity and equality, shouldn't our story include Indigenous peoples? In this era of reconciliation, we need to share the truth first. And reimagine the narrative of this land and this city together.
I don't think there's a better way to start this event. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ibukun Abejirinde, and we want to open this event by acknowledging that the sacred land on which Women's College Hospital operates has been the home and hunting grounds to Indigenous peoples for thousands of years. This includes the Huron-Wendat, the Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon, One Poom Belt Covenant, and it invites us to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place that is now called Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. I'm grateful that as an immigrant, I've had the opportunity to live, work, and thrive on this land. And I invite you to reflect on where you are now, where you are coming from, what counts as home for you, I know we have participants online who are joining the ceremony. Feel free to engage in the chat and share and acknowledge the lands that you are from. On behalf of the project team, I am so pleased that after almost a year of planning and preparation, we can invite you in person and virtual to come into dialogue with us as we cross-pollinate and share knowledge and advance thinking on how to promote equitable and integrated newcomer and settlement support for refugees and immigrants to Canada. I'd like to acknowledge that this day would not have been possible without funding and support from SHERC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, Quest AV, who today is providing the stellar audiovisual support we're having, Women's College Hospital, who has provided their spaces for us to gather, and the Dalalana School of Public Health, University of Toronto, that has also provided in-kind support to host this event. This morning we're joking about, why did we pick this day? And I was like, well, why not? Part of that reason is this year, 2024, actually marks 39 years since what is known as the Singh decision came into law, where Canada's Supreme Court upheld our Charter of Rights and Freedom. And in that decision, it was confirmed that refugees have fundamental rights that must be protected. And now more than ever, we need to be reminded of this as we around the world continue to bear witness to multiple injustices against various groups by way of their religion, ethnicity, race, skin color, many more. So I think it's important to recognize that the journey between legal decisions and actual change at a societal and global level is yet to be finished, and that's part of the work we're here to do today. In 2022 alone, Canada had an unprecedented number of asylum seekers arriving on our shores, seeking protection and refuge. And I think it's important that we situate these events, these instruments, legal and societal, within the context of our conversations as we stare within each other and for each other and awakening to realize that there are still gaps, but yet there are also opportunities by which we can better support immigrants to settle and integrate into Canada, and why it's actually important morally and ethically for us to do so. So in April, so today starts April Dialogue. So the way we've tagged it is Dialogue 1 is in April and Dialogue 2 is in May. And each dialogue comprises 2 days, Monday and Tuesdays. In April, it's today and tomorrow, and in May, it's 13th and 14th. And these will be hybrid events, except for the 14th, which is going to be a co-design workshop. And we're going to have programming run between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. every day. The idea is between the months to have time in between the space to reflect, to connect, to build on what we've discussed and culminate in the event and the workshop in May. So today we're starting Dialogue 1, Day 1. Now I'm giving the opening remarks, after which I will introduce Professor Anna to come give the keynote. Then there will be a moderated Q&A in discussion with Professor Nancy Clark. Then we'll break for lunch. There'll be opportunities to network. And that will then follow after lunch, which is going to be a hard follow, for me to present our research findings and tell you the story of how we got to this event. And then there'll be open discussions before we close. That being said, it's very hard to compete with a solar eclipse. So the plan is we're going to try and finish earlier. So I've been following the news, and it's like it's supposed to be between 2:18 and 3:18, and there's going to be 19 seconds of glory around 3:15. I'm going to try for us to finish by 2:30 at the latest today, and I think we can make it happen. Tomorrow, we're going to do a recap. We're going to start the day with a recap, and then we'll have panel presentations where we'll have a panel of 4 presenting on different topics. That will be followed by a moderated discussion. We'll break for lunch and networking again, and then we'll have scholar presentations followed by Q&A. We're going to have a graphic recorder in the room tomorrow, and she will present the visual output of our conversations for the first dialogue, and then we'll close. For tips, this is the information for Wi-Fi and password, in case you were wondering. I can see also in the room, there's also a board here that has the information. Quest AV is providing all the tech support, and I think it's very important to get that right when you're having an event tagged Beyond Technology. There's coffee right outside. Feel free to have your fill. If it does get cold, you can still pour some coffee, and then there's a microwave around the corner so you could warm it up. Feel free to go out and come in as you wish, whether you're in person or online. The restroom actually is, if you go out and you hit the coffee table, you make a turn to the right, and then you will see it dead center in front of you. Emergency exits are right here, and then there's also at the back. Hopefully we won't need the emergency, but just in case you know where it is. We recognize and acknowledge that our Muslim colleagues are observing the period of Ramadan. If you need to take some breaks to go pray, there's a prayer room on the ground floor, asking the welcoming or reception desk. It's the Labyrinth, and there's a dedicated prayer room. Please try to return your badges upon departure. We're trying to be economically and environmentally safe, and so we plan to reuse them. No shame in mentioning it. Key personnel for today, if you're looking for wayfinding, I think I missed a slide. Let's see. Yes, so there's me, Ibukun. There's Isabel, who you would have met outside at the check-in desk. There's Nancy. Nancy's over here. There's Ogana in the room over there, and there's Priya. Ogana and Priya supporting the online participants and helping us take detailed notes for our recap. So, without further ado, and because I plan to meet our timeline, it is my pleasure to now invite Professor Anna Triandafyllidou, who is a political scientist and Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration at Toronto Metropolitan University. She is the scientific director of Bridging Divides, which is a $98.4 million multi-university and multi-partner program funded by the Canada First Research Excellence Fund. Her talk today is a keynote titled Canadian Immigration and Integration, Mind the Gap. The floor is yours, Anna.
Thank you, Ibukun. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for being here. Yes, indeed, we're not only competing with the Easter religious festivities. You can't, at least, in spring there is, Easter, Ramadan. This year's Ramadan is traveling through spring, this Passover, And I remember we connected 2 months ago, and we were thinking, okay, let's so be it. It's going to be the 8th of April. Very happy to be here. I'd like to start by saying a couple of things about myself. As Ibukun said, I'm a professor. I hold a Canada Excellence Research Chair at TMU. I'm a new Canadian. I came to Canada in 2019. And I want to acknowledge, first of all, that I'm an uninvited guest. I'm also a settler in this land. I'm one of these luxury immigrants that can come to Canada. But at the same time, I think I feel how can I say, grateful and also proud to be able to be here and say, we in Canada do this, we in Canada do that, which I think isn't taken for granted in most places. I'm originally from Greece, but I lived most of my adult life in other European countries, in the most part, but also Belgium and Britain, and stay in the United States. So I study migration and I practice migration. Before I started, when Ibukun first invited me, I said, what do I know about health and well-being that I can tell you about? You guys know everything. But then Ibukun said, no, we would like you to give a bit of the bigger picture, the things that we're not normally looking at in our day-to-day work, so that somehow this also helps me more with issues of migrant and racialized people, health and well-being, but also I hope it can give you some sense of the bigger picture and how your work fits into that. And before starting this kind of bird's eye view on immigration policy and numbers and policies and narratives, I want to also acknowledge, I was really thinking after I did my PowerPoint, I was thinking about it. This morning, we live in a very peculiar moment after COVID. Now, obviously, the pandemic was ground zero for migration. So, like, after a very intensive period of human mobility that culminated in 2018 in the global compacts on migrants and on refugees, and this feeling, mobility is so much intensifying, we had COVID that brought almost the globe to a near standstill, with a lot of inequities and a lot of even of preferential movement and people being trapped in places. The other thing that I'm realizing, and I'm not a conflict, peace and conflict scholar, it seems like hell set loose after COVID. Like, there's so much conflict around the world, and I'm also grappling as a migration scholar as to what does this mean in like, was there something, was it, like, we're looking into how migration restarted after COVID, and we do find a certain, how can I say, phenomenon of compression, as if people were stuck, so they had time to think, to gather their resources, and then up they went, we all went to mobility. But also there's something about conflict. There is the intensification of climate change. 2023 was apparently the warmest year on record. And at the same time, globally, we're seeing, unfortunately, authoritarian populism rising just next door in the South. It's going to be a reckoning this year with the election, but also around the world. Think of Russia, think of India, think of China, think of Brazil and Argentina. Democracy is fragile, and it is also true that democracy is not always delivering. And last but not least, what is very close to your topic today is technological transformation, which is both a challenge and an opportunity. So advanced digital technologies help us overcome so many challenges and achieve so many things that we couldn't do before. And this before is not 50 years ago, it's even 10 years ago or 15 years ago. At the same time, they are potentially a big challenge because of the digital divide. So such simple things as not having stable access to the internet, but they're also a challenge when we look at how social media, unfortunately, promote polarization. So they promote through the well-known echo chambers and everything else, that people actually grow apart instead of growing together. So I want to acknowledge this bigger context before I start speaking about the Canadian immigration landscape and policy, and also to say that within all this, in Canada, we take pride in still being a safe country, a democratic country, a fairly equitable country, although with a lot of problems. And at the same time, we shouldn't sit on our laurels and think, oh, we're doing well. We need to keep trying and keep working hard. And on this, I very much acknowledge this project and this conference and set of 4 working days, because that's part, I think, of our commitment and our obligation as scholars to keep thinking of how we should make sure things improve, and how we also address the complex diversity that characterizes our society. But now let me get to some more facts and figures, because I think oftentimes the public debate doesn't present the full picture on migration. And there is a lot of course, people don't need to be immigration experts, but there is a lot of, how can I say, half-truths that are said. So we have heard recently that immigration has exponentially increased in Canada. Now, this is both true and false. Canada has been accepting a certain number of permanent residents, and that's what, until a year ago, when the newspapers were talking or TV was talking about immigration in Canada, that's what they referred to. So the numbers of new permanent residents. And as you can see, there recently we have gotten close to 500,000 per year, and actually that's the target for the next 3 years, to stabilize at 500,000. Mind you, we're a country of 40 million. I think that's also important to keep in mind. How many is 500,000 depends on how big is the country. To give you a sense, in about 10 to 15 years ago, the number of new permanent residents that Canada would welcome would be 250,000 to 175,000. So certainly this number has increased, but still it is comparatively small if we look at the number of temporary residents that Canada is receiving. And that is a number that was kept very much, not in the shadow, but like wasn't looked at. It was just researchers that were counting those people and even having trouble distinguishing between how many came or how many are here. because you would have data on how many new, for instance, work permits or study permits Canada has issued every year, but there was trouble in assessing how many people were present in the country, and there you can see that this number has risen. One reason why this number has risen so exponentially between 2022 and 2023 is that they changed the way they count people. So there was a technical issue about whether Stats Canada was counting the people that were renewing their visas, and they were not. And suddenly they realized we have to do that because these people are still in the country. So if we're trying to say how many people are in Canada, we should include those people. And that's why it's not that there was a huge change. Still, 2.2 million people are present with temporary permits right now in Canada, and that's about 6% of the population. It's probably one of the highest figures of temporary residents. Now, here I also want to open and close a bracket. I don't know how many of you have experiences of whether being in your country of origin, if it is not Canada, or having lived, if you are from Canada, if you haven't lived in another countries. The fact that Canadian immigration policy would expect everyone to come as a permanent resident, to come and stay here, settle, is very unusual. Most countries accept people on a temporary basis, and then you stay some years, and then through different processes, each country has its own, you transition to usually something called a long-term permit, a permanent permit, the right to abode. So for instance, in the UK, it's called the right to abode. In Italy, it's called an indefinite right to stay. So the fact that in Canada, the idea was that someone comes and day one, you're a permanent resident. So you do your homework at home, you apply, you're invited to apply, do everything. And then first day you come in the country, you're a permanent resident, is very unusual. It doesn't happen only in Canada, but say Canada is one. So there's a few people that have the same pathway in Australia. In the US, it's very unusual. Very few people come into the US with a permanent, with a permanent status. So this is, I think it is important to know that this is a particularity. Now, I'll speak more about the whole temporary and permanent migration landscape in a minute. I want to say, coming back to the focus of this conference, I think it is important to say that immigrants are part and parcel of not only Canadian economy, but Canadian society. Not only 1 in 3 business owners is an immigrant, but also 1 in 4 healthcare workers is a newcomer. And technically, a newcomer is someone from 0 to 5, not from arrival, 0 to 5 years from becoming a permanent resident. So if you come as a permanent resident from day 1, then that's 0 to 5 years from arrival. But if, for instance, you studied here, maybe you're a newcomer even if you have been here for several years during your studies. Now let me, however, delve a little bit deeper into issues of immigration and employment. As I said, 1 in 4 health workers is a newcomer, 1 in 3 people who own businesses is an immigrant. And I use the word immigrant to say someone who is not born in Canada. And of course, we can see that there can be people who arrived here as children and people who arrived here as adults, after their studies, for instance. I want to also, again, going back a little bit to the pandemic and to the bigger landscape, when we try to make sense of how the admissions policy has evolved, we need to remember that Canada, first of all, was one of the few countries that during the pandemic remained relatively open. The borders were permeable if you had specific reasons to come into the country. Again, I'll give the example, unlike Australia, that just sealed its borders for over a year. And even Australians couldn't leave the country, let alone people come in. And also Canada was a country that told its temporary residents, you're one of us, you stay here. Again, I'll give the example of Australia and New Zealand, which said, work permit holders, students, this is the time to go home. We cannot take care of you. So I think this is important to remember in the country. But when we look at the employment outlook, we know that still in spring and summer 2022, there were 1 million jobs vacant. You will remember the newspapers going all out and about, and even the business owners and the big employers saying, oh, we're going to take our business and go abroad because you're not bringing in people fast. We miss talent. IRCC stands for Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada. IRCC is very slow and very bureaucratic. And I think it was a bit of a big change that happened in about a year between, say, late or summer or fall 2022 and fall 2023, when suddenly we see the unemployment rising a little bit and many concerns, oh, we're too many in this country, you're bringing in too many people. And if you look at survey data, they show that people are increasingly positive about immigration in Canada, about the richness that immigrants bring to Canadian societies and to Canadian society and Canadian communities. They're positive overall about whether immigration is good for the economy, but they are still positive. Still, over 50% of Canadians disagree with the statement, there's too many immigrants in Canada. But while they used to be 77% positive, now they're 57% positive. So people are a little bit worried. But I think we need to put this worry and it doesn't matter that I don't see my slide, but yeah, whatever. So that we went to employment at capacity. The economy did create a lot of new jobs, and there were a lot of new people coming, and a lot of these people were temporary with, I would say, mixed status. And by mixed status, I mean, for instance, in a young family, there would be one person that is applying to study in Canada, and their spouse receives an open permit, so their spouse is working and is taking one of these jobs that are created in the labor market, and their kids are going to school. So this also has changed our perception of who are the international students, because we might have thought international students are 18-year-olds or 20-year-olds that come here as single people. That is also the case, but not always the case. However, I think 5.8% unemployment is not a high unemployment. Again, to give context, economists tell us 5% is full employment. So I don't know why, because I never understood that. Why shouldn't 0% unemployment be full employment? But they tell us 5% is normal. And also we know, however, that within this full employment and within this very dynamic labor market, newcomers and immigrants in general, not just newcomers, not just 0 to 5 from permanent residency, face a lot of problems in having their professional experience and their education, when it has been acquired abroad, being recognized in Canada, and particularly in professions like in the health sector, where you have to be licensed for the different professions, not just medical doctors, but all the other professions that are involved in the health sector. So we know that there is a big gap there, and a lot of people are not working in their skills area. So there is a huge brain waste and brain underusage that we're facing in Canada that we need to address. So I think these are important points to understand the context, and oftentimes they're lost when we, of course, are facing an affordable housing crisis, and suddenly people are thinking with the simple maths. There's X number of houses, there's more number of people, so then houses are more expensive. It is not like, I think in this case, mathematics is not a good guide, because things are more complicated. But without going into the affordable housing question, I want to say again, in relation to the focus of these 4 days and this conference, that the other thing that we know is a moving target, and is, again, a big opportunity, but it needs to be supported and addressed so that it doesn't create inequities, but rather supports more equity and less exclusion, is advanced digital technologies. So we know that advanced digital technologies are progressing very fast. There is a huge investment happening there, both from public resources, but also from private resources. And there is a huge economy around advanced digital technologies. And we are told that in Canada, we expect just the public investment to rise to $500 million per year by 2025. And also on this, I think we shouldn't lose sight of the importance of the health sector in Canada, that is over 10% of the GDP, and that is also expected to rise, both because Canada has, in my view, a very good public health system, and a system that actually is public, which is very important, and at the same time, we have an aging society, and we are going to be, our needs for healthcare will increase through the years. Let me now go to more specifically Canadian immigration policy. And I want to, here in my talk, actually distinguish, but also contrast a bit the policies with the narratives, and talk both about the policies and the narratives that characterize Canadian immigration policy. So since the introduction of the famous express entry system and the points system, which started in the 70s, was revised a few times in 2001 and again in 2012 to 14. So we have three main pathways through which people come to Canada. One is the so-called economic pathway. This is what in lay terms we would call labor migration. There is the humanitarian pathway, which is about resettled refugees. And then there's the family pathway, and these are people who are family of Canadian permanent residents and citizens. And to give you a sense of and this refers to permanent residents only. That's also something to keep in mind. It doesn't refer to the temporary. And within each year, within the permanent resident quota, roughly it's 60% economic, 30% family, 10% humanitarian. And also, again, to give you a sense, in the US, it's 60% family, 30% economic. Well, now it's less than 10% humanitarian. So Canada, and in this way it's very similar to Australia, has a strong emphasis on economic pathways, so people coming here to work, but also coming here to settle. And one of my favorite actually expressions when I present about Canada abroad, I say, in Canada we bring people, we don't bring workers. It is a famous sentence that I'm sure you know, Ibukun, that was discussed about Germany in the 60s and the 70s when they had the guest worker schemes. And I can't remember which scholar said, well, we invited workers, but people came, which meant people came with their families, with their expectations, and many people went back, but many people also stayed. So that was the idea of denying the thing that guest workers, like there's no guest worker scheme unless you're prepared to really enforce in a very undemocratic ways. But what I say in Canada, we don't invite workers, we invite people. So the idea is people come and they stay. And that's why we also use the term settlement, which is generally not used in other countries in terms of migration. You talk about resettlement of refugees, but you generally don't talk about settlement of migrants. You talk perhaps about integration, about insertion in the labor market. But here we use this term of settlement because we're thinking that people are coming and then they will go through a process of finding their ways into society and settling down. Now, what is special about economic immigration pathways in Canada is they're very proactive. So as you saw, Canada invites new people to come. In the last 3 to 4 decades, I mean, in the past, in the 20th century until a certain point, the 19th century, they were very racist. Racism was repealed, and now economic immigration is open. As I said, it's proactive, it's planned, and it's supposed to be permanent. Now, again, you have to take into account the geographical morphology of Canada, so immigration can be planned. So this idea that we have that we can control our borders is also something very unusual. If you think of Latin America, if you think of Europe, if you think of the Middle East, if you think of Southeast Asia, borders are much more permeable and people travel between countries. Canada is a huge landmass, the second largest country in the world, with a relatively small population, 3 oceans around it, and the United States in the south. So it's a very peculiar landscape within which Canadian immigration policy develops, but it is really both proactive, so welcoming, but also there is this expectation that we have full control of our immigration. And again, my other mantra is immigration can be managed, but it cannot be fully controlled. So I think that is something that I also want to comment upon when I speak about asylum seeking. Also, Canada has a very strong, as you probably know, a very strong system of settlement supports. There is a lot of civil society organizations that are funded by the federal government and also by the province, sometimes also by the city, to help people find their ways. This is employment support, support to families to learn the language, to get your kids to school, to find ways of training and retraining. And there is a feeling, which is again very peculiar to Canada, that the country is giving you a promise and it has to uphold this promise. Now, again, those of you who have experiences in other countries will probably have realized that oftentimes immigrants find a completely different environment where you're told, this is a favor that we're doing to you, that we have you here, and if you don't like it, go back. Now, this is not the case in Canada. And yet, we do know that there is a huge de-skilling happening, particularly for immigrants who come from places other than Europe, and their credentials are not recognized, their professional experience is not recognized, and they face really very many hoops to jump, which cost a lot of money and a lot of time. And we know we have people who come with 10, 15 years of experience with the promise that Canada gave them, and it's not fulfilling. In my own university, one of the most successful programs of our Chang School for Continuing Education is a program that makes medical and health professionals find the way outside the medical and the paramedical profession. And it is a success program because still people find something meaningful to do, to develop to use their skills. But then that, I think, in a way says it all. And of course, unfortunately, there's still discrimination. And we are fighting to change that, but it is true that there is discrimination, and it is intersectional, as we know. Of course, race and ethnicity plays a role, but religion plays a role, even perceptions of your culture, where you come from, women, men, LGBTQ+, the different expressions of gender are there. And we also know that this is a process that is ongoing. Having the policies is unfortunately not sufficient. Another element of economic immigration I think is important to keep in mind is the so-called regionalization. Now, again, this is a very special word in Canada. Regionalization means attracting and retaining people in the smaller places, in the medium-sized town and in the small towns all around the country. And as you can imagine, this is a tough one because particularly in the areas, that are, for instance, up north and farther from big urban centers, there are particular challenges when it comes to transportation, when it comes also to jobs or education. A family may settle in a small town, say in Saskatchewan or Alberta, but then when their kids get older and they want a post-secondary institution, they need to move to a bigger town or send their kids to a bigger town. Or also often we know that new immigrants go to the smaller places. This is a good job for, say, the principal applicant or one of the two parents, but the other spouse doesn't have a good job. And that's where, of course, within economic immigration, we have what is called provincial nominee programs, which are special programs now that all provinces have to attract specific people with the skills that they need. And actually what we know is that oftentimes these provincial nominee programs these days rely on what is called a two-step migration. So people enter through, so an employer is looking for people to work, say, in the oil industry in Alberta or in a food processing industry or in some other manufacturing or education, for instance, job. People come in with a temporary work permit and then they apply for PNP, even though in theory the PNP program is designed to attract people from abroad. Now, for me, there's a lot of good things in the economic immigration pathway in Canada, and as I said, the fact that it's very proactive, pro-immigration, and there is a feeling that you have a promise to fulfill. What is my concern is that it fuels very much an instrumental narrative. And we see that now when we have the affordable housing crisis and this whole concern, there might be too many people coming in the country, or actually too fast. People are coming too fast. The pace of immigration is too fast. And I think this idea, while it is, first of all, a reciprocal idea, like you come because you have certain skills, but we also owe you something. We owe you to to enable you to use your skills. But at the same time, we shouldn't forget we're bringing people, we're not bringing workers, so the narrative cannot be just instrumental. Are these people good for Canada? And we know that by design, the system is, so for instance, Canada is the country with the highest number of people with post-secondary education among the OECD countries. I might say in the world, because in the OECD you have all these countries. I think at this point we've surpassed also Korea. But why? Because all the immigrants are highly educated. Actually, the non-Canadian born are more highly educated than the Canadian born. So I think for me there, the good and the bad thing is very much intertwined in economic immigration, and I think even if the express entry system and the economic immigration pathway is designed to bring people that can do well in Canada, we shouldn't forget that our society is not just about this optimal skills or optimal economic growth, it's also about people and about communities. And that's perhaps where family immigration comes in. So there too, Canada is relatively generous. Family is understood mostly as the nuclear family, but for instance, all types of relationships, you don't need to be legally married. If you declare you're a common law partner, you can get in. Your children can get in, and you're until age 18, and if they are unmarried, until age 22. So there is a certain consideration that people who come to, and for instance, as you probably know, when you apply for permanent residency, there is a principal applicant and the whole family comes in. But even if you apply for a temporary permit, with the exception of the seasonal agricultural workers program, in all other programs, people can bring their families. And until recently, the spouses, for instance, have an open work permit so they can work in Canada. So it is. So the idea is that people should be able to bring their families and live with their families, and there is a recognition of the right to family life. However, unfortunately, the program does much less well when it comes to a slightly more extended definition of family. So when it comes to grandparents, the parents of young adults who want to come, or for instance, when it comes to siblings or extended family. And then particularly, I want to highlight the so-called PGP, Parents and Grandparents Program, which has grown increasingly restrictive. And it is, of course, given that the new immigrants in Canada come mostly from, outside the old Commonwealth or outside Europe, it really affects disproportionately people from Asia and Africa and the Middle East and Latin America. Because right now, as things are, and actually since COVID, the applications have been closed, so people have to apply, they have to show a certain level of income, they have to sign that they're going to support their parents for a long time. I think different durations have been on the table, but we're talking 10 years or more. And yet it's a lottery. So you apply, you satisfy all the criteria, and then there is a lottery. And there was about 20,000 places per year, but now the program was oversubscribed, and there has been no possibility to submit new applications after 2020. So they're still affecting the lottery on the old applications, which gives several years of wait for the people who try to bring their parents or the grandparents of their children. And you can imagine, some of these people are in the younger cohort of the old age, but some of these people are in the older cohort, and it's very hard to be distant from your family. There is an alternative program that is called Super Visa, which allows to bring your parents, so the grandparents, in Canada, provided you pay for the health insurance, which is a very high economic burden for families because, again, people are old, they might have ailments, so the insurance fee is pretty high. And also, it's a visa for 10 years for multiple entries, up to 2 years stay at a time. The grandparent cannot work. Again, think some grandparents might be 75 or 80, but some grandparents might be 62 or 65. So they would be able to do some part-time, might desire to work and contribute. And we know there's been quite a few studies that have been discussing the effect that this has to children in terms of having their grandparents near them, but also to parents in terms of having support, a wider family circle, and even support with childcare. And then I think that's what I want to emphasize in terms of the family immigration. I see a moral and political dilemma that I'm not sure I have a very clear answer to. So the moral dilemma, actually both positions that I will talk about have both the moral and the political aspect in them. So one is, if I am a citizen, why shouldn't I be able to bring my parents? Why am I different from other citizens? Because my parents or I were born abroad. If I am a citizen, I contribute to this country. So that would be a much more liberal policy towards grandparents. And as a citizen, what about the best interests of my children? And the other, of course, is the so-called or famous progressive dilemma. So do we incorporate in the welfare system people who didn't contribute to the welfare system? So obviously these grandparents didn't contribute to the welfare system or the healthcare system of Canada. At the same time, their children are contributing, their grandchildren will be contributing. But it is true that it is not an easy answer. But that's where also I think the narrative there has been very much an economic narrative instead of a moral narrative, because there should be a moral narrative, in my view, speaking about what makes people having a good life, and how, for instance, different definitions of family are important in different ways in different cultures, and how we can find a system that is much more generous, because at the end of the day, Canada is economically a strong country. And also, there is certainly an argument to be made about how this would even allow, for instance, for women to get more fully in the labor market if they had more supports, rather than having to care for their children here, but also, both parents also care for grandparents abroad. So actually, these are two kind of loopholes in the Canadian, in the positive Canadian immigration narrative. Now let me move to the question of the humanitarian immigration. So Canada has a wealth of programs there to provide protection to people who need it. Again, given our geography, it's not that generally asylum seekers come in the country. It's Canada goes into UNHCR camps in different parts of the world and brings people. So these are the resettled refugees. There are different ways of bringing people and supporting them. It used to be very much public support. Now there's been a bigger role for private sponsorship. Again, you may be familiar with it. 5 people can get together who are friends and sponsor a family, or a family can sponsor another family. And what actually many experts working on resettlement and refugees have pointed out is that there has been an increasing role for private sponsorship while the state seems to be receding its support. That's of course a consideration. On the other hand, I think Canada has been recognized globally as a pioneer on the private sponsorship program, and we've also seen among studies that refugees that are privately sponsored initially fare better than those who are publicly sponsored. Now, of course, more detailed studies are inviting us to look at the fact that sometimes those who are privately sponsored are people who have extended family in Canada. So it's not just about the 1 year of sponsorship, whether you have a family or a group of people supporting you and lending you their networks, versus the state that is a big machinery but doesn't have those private networks. But it is also that people come to integrate into a wider community, so obviously that helps. However, I think there is a part of Canadian refugee policies that is generally overlooked, and this is what I call the complementary pathways and asylum seekers. And this is both a mixed picture, lots of light and lots of shadow in there for me. The light that I see is what I call the smaller programs. So Canada is again unique in the world in having programs. So there is a crisis somewhere. There's a crisis in Sudan. There's a crisis right now. There's war in Gaza. There was, for instance, the earthquake in Turkey and Syria in early 2023. Canada usually issues this immediate small program that says, if you have family, and this is extended family, so say if a Canadian citizen or permanent resident, so permanent residents in that are very much, in many of, as you know, many of the rights are equaled with citizens. So if you have a sibling, grandparent, or other member of your extended family and their family, so you have a sibling and their family in those places, you can invite them to come to Canada through the small programs. Of course, you have to support them. But then usually they come with something called a temporary resident permit, which is a very temporary thing. But then you find ways to get them through the permanent residency system. So this is, I think, a very positive element. And there's been also then the larger, what I call them like that, the larger programs, that Canada in 2021, after the Taliban entered Kabul and took over the Afghan state, Canada offered protection to up to 40,000 Afghans and their families who had worked for the forces for the Canadian or the Allied forces. We know now that nearly 50,000 people have arrived in Canada. It's been a long process and a protracted one. It testifies to a certain level of solidarity and generosity, and same for the most recent program of Venezuelans, Haitians, and Colombians, which interestingly opened earlier in fall 2023 and closed within 2 months. The 15,000 positions were taken. Now, there's a footnote to be made there, particularly for the Afghans, because obviously the people who worked for the forces were young and spoke English. So that says something. In Canada, the refugee resettlement program in the last 30 years has been one based on vulnerability, not on fit. So Canada brings the most vulnerable people, not the people that will do better, that are more highly skilled. And the Afghans, I think, of course, these people were the most vulnerable under the Taliban, but at the same time, it kind of seems to be, there seems to be a second thought there also, that these people will find it easy to integrate in society. And then there's two programs or two issues that are, in my view, slightly more controversial. One is the program for Ukrainians. This is the only program that Canada ever did without the cap. So Canada basically introduced a 3-year temporary status for people fleeing the Russian invasion in Ukraine. We know that over 1 million people applied and about 300,000 have arrived in the country. We also know that they are 50-50 men and women. And I'm saying this because in most European countries where Ukrainians went as first, asylum, they were mostly women and children, because the men were obliged to stay and fight. And what does this tell us about the people who have arrived in Canada is that most of the time they were not coming from Ukraine itself. They were already abroad. Now, this is, I'm not advocating against the Ukraine program, but I cannot fail to notice the big differences in the numbers among these programs. And I think what we need to think is, if we can do it for Ukrainians, why cannot do it for others? And I know, and we had recently a webinar with the minister, and I asked the same question, and he said, yes, okay, Canada cannot solve all of the world's issues, and we're trying, and we're working with our, for instance, thinking of Haiti and Venezuela, we're working with our partners in the world, et cetera, et cetera. But it is true that this is a stark contrast, and the justification is that this is about our values, but I think our values of democracy and peace and solidarity and equity are undermined when the crisis in Sudan or in the DRC or in Afghanistan or in Ukraine. And the other element that I'm a bit less happy about how we're doing is the inland asylum claimants. So as I was saying, Canada is a country where you can't very simply arrive on foot like it happens in other world regions. But of course, there are people who can cross the Canadian-US border, and there's been a lot of publicity on this, a lot of media coverage in the last couple of years, the famous Roxham Road, which is a small provincial road from upstate New York to Quebec. And 2022 was considered a crisis year because nearly 40,000 people entered through Roxham Road and applied for asylum in Canada. Now think, 40,000 people, we are 40 million. And we admit every year 500,000 permanent residents and over 1 million of temporary residents. So my question was, did Roxham Road rock the boat? Did we suddenly become too many? But I think this is what brings us back to the narrative of full control. We're in control of our borders, and we cannot tolerate that we're not. The other element, I think, is that right now, as you know, the Safe Third Country Agreement has been revised, and it's much more difficult for people to come through the US. But I think there I would, and although I think the discourse of the government was kind of thoughtful, saying, a lot of things are happening in the world. We want to provide for protection. At the same time, the US should be an honest partner rather than bus people to, can't remember the name of the city that is near the border there in upstate New York. So like bus the people from New York City to that small town and then give them a taxi ride to the border. This is not what this is supposed to be. But still, it makes us think, how much are we ready to accept people that make their way to the country rather than just come through our highly controlled system? And I think that's also something about our narrative of what kind of a society we want to be, and how do we balance concerns that are true about the economy, the welfare, the healthcare system, and concerns about solidarity and equity within Canada and in the world. Now let me speak, and I realize I'm getting close to my time. Let me speak about the gaps in the system when it comes to the more long-term view of migration. So one gap that we have seen and has hit again the headlines recently is these transitions from temporary to permanent. Because as I was saying, the permanent residence number is always capped, but the temporary is always uncapped until this year. We just heard 2 weeks ago that the minister is going to cap the number of temporary migrants that Canada will admit in the coming year, again, out of these concerns that there's too many people coming with temporary status. I'm sure you have seen that international students have been very much in the spotlight, while actually what we know is there are more temporary work permits given rather than study permits given in 2022 and 2023, which tells us something about needs in different sectors and how employers try to fill those needs, and how these things are also very complex. So I think there is one concern there in terms of gaps in the system, that people face very important bottlenecks. At this point, I think someone who is young, highly educated, has an MA, a job offer, and doesn't speak French outside Quebec might find it very hard to make it through the permanent residency selection system, because the points have gone so high because of how many people came, like were here during COVID and then came in, that is like people, there's nothing they can do. Actually, we have a researcher in our team. I said, go learn French. So you can because you get a few extra points if you are a French speaker outside Quebec. I said, what can I tell you? Like your age, you're highly skilled, you have a job, you speak English, like everything. I don't know what else, what can you do? You can, or some people who are just a bit more advanced with age, you can become younger, but at the same time, what is the problem is that you are settled in this country. You may have lived in this country for 5, 6, 7 years, studied and then worked, and you're facing this bottleneck in the transition. So this is an important issue, and we can discuss if the government is doing the right mix of policies to address this issue, but certainly it is an important issue, and that's where I think I have some disagreements with economists who say, oh, we should look at GDP per capita, and new immigrants don't have such a high GDP per capita, but I'm saying, yeah, that's normal when you go to a new country, and after all, if people haven't made your life here, no matter through which type of permit, that should count in the equation. We cannot just say it's all about our points and the skills. And the other thing, of course, is the problem with permanent residents. I mentioned this before. Unfortunately, there's persistent brain waste and discrimination. And there is also, despite the fact that, as I said, we have a lot of supports, the so-called settlement services in all areas of life, there is very low uptake. So apparently a lot of people don't even know these services exist, and about 10% of newcomers who are entitled to use the services use them. But among those who use them, a vast majority were very happy with these services. So there's something there, and that's where I believe there's something to be done with technology. So that is where I think advanced digital technologies can probably revolutionize the way we share information, the way we deliver services. Unfortunately, we know right now there's not a very good system. When you become a permanent resident, you receive a letter or you receive an email and there is a link and you have to go to a website that, as most websites, is bewildering in terms of complexity. And we know that also the whole, what is called the settlement sector, so the civil society organizations that work in this area have been transitioned into a hybrid model after COVID, but this was a sector that was very much a person-to-person sector. So I think we need to do more work there to see how we combine the person-to-person that is always invaluable with some more digital technological solutions, and also the support for pre-arrival services, particularly for those who come as permanent residents. So do some preparation while you're abroad so you can hit the ground running and face less hurdles when you're here. And another, I think, thorny issue here is how much services and how much support you provide to temporary residents. So far in Canada, it's been really black and white. Like if you're a permanent resident, you receive things. If you're a temporary, you don't receive anything. Ontario has a program funded by the province that supports international students, for instance. Because think about it again, in an ideal world, you're an international student, you're a highly skilled person, you know you'll find a way to apply. But what we know is international students face a lot of hurdles because they don't know, obviously. I don't even know, like I'm an immigration scholar, but I don't know the details of the immigration law and under which category you have to apply and what exactly do you need to present and what is the best channel for you. And in Canada, universities are not supposed to provide this kind of services because their international student offices are not certified immigration consultants. So I think there is now some thinking happening also at the federal government that there should be some partnership between post-secondary institutions, the settlement sector, and provinces to provide some of these services. Or again, after a certain number of years, like you cannot make these very hard distinctions between temporary and permanent. And that's where, and also, okay, I don't want to take too much time because I realize I've been speaking for too long, but you may have heard that the Prime Minister had in his mandate letter to the Immigration Minister already nearly 3 years ago now, a requirement to get to do a regularization program for the people who have fallen out of status. And again, given Canada's morphology, we know that mostly the people who fall out of status are overstayers, people who didn't manage to transition from one permit to the other, and eventually decided not to leave the country. And we don't have data as to who is leaving the country. Actually, in my team, we're trying to create a scientific estimate of the out-of-status population. But the truth is, in Canada, we know a lot about who is coming, about who is staying. We know less about who is leaving. So if you're given, an order to leave because your permit renewal or extension or whatever has been refused, whether you're leaving, we don't know, except for those cases, which are not that numerous, where the police has to come and put you in detention and expel you. So, but the question I think here is also, should we be slightly rethinking our narrative? And that is my last slide. Yeah. So I think what I've been wanting to present in this lecture is a little bit give you an overview of the system, the lights and the shadows, the different channels, the different opportunities, but also the challenges or the gaps, what I have called. But I want to also turn the question to you and ask ourselves, how is Canadian society changing in the midst of a changing world? So our world is not the same that it was in the 70s and the 80s. And for instance, there's I think the international relations theorists are a bit at a loss into what kind of system we've heard, we had the post-Cold War system, the multilateral system. Now they're not clear as to, but certainly what we can say is we live in a very much an interconnected world, and both those of us who live in this country are connected with family and friends and communities and colleagues all around the world. But at the same time, the world is much more mobile. And oftentimes when migrants move, they don't move once and for all. In the past, people would come to this country and not be able to visit for 10 years because it was very expensive and there was no smartphones and all that. You had to go and, I remember that, making very expensive phone calls to family back home. This has changed. At the same time, unfortunately, in the world, we see more conflict and more inequality between the haves and the have-nots. And certainly Canada is among the affluent countries. The other thing is North America and Europe are aging societies, like a good part of Asia too. So how do we think about the demographic challenge together? Because I think also seeing the demographic challenge as Canada is aging society, so we need to import new young people, is not enough. We need to think of it together as an interactive process. And then when it comes, I think, back to the health care sector, we need to understand the complex health needs, and I think that's where the pandemic was a little bit of an opportunity and a big tragedy, to the extent that it showed that, for instance, mental and physical health are very much intertwined, and these are things that affect everyone. It's not just the asylum seeker or the homeless person that has these challenges. Everyone has these challenges. And at the same time, I think it showed that we all have very complex aspirations, and a good system should be a system that, provides for all of us, not just for those who are, the strongest or the fittest. And I think I will leave it at that. Thank you very much for your attention and patience. I suppose we're going to go there, but I don't know if we need mic. Yeah.
I think it's on now. Well, first of all, Anna, I just want to thank you for that excellent presentation and distilling the complexity of immigration policy to a way that we can understand it, because it is a very complex system. And lots of things to unpack there. So thank you again for contextualizing that, but also contextualizing it in the bigger picture of what's happening in the world today in terms of the conflict, the climate change, the polarization that we're seeing. One of the things, so what we're hoping to do is engage the audience that's here and also the people online with some questions for you, some Q&A. If that's okay. And I'm wondering, maybe while people are percolating their thoughts or ideas, if maybe I should ask you a question, just out of courtesy, just to start us off, maybe? Yep. Okay, that's great. So again, thank you so much. And this is a very complex topic. And especially when you talked about, one of the things that really stood out is changing the narrative, and what narrative are we wanting, and how do we change that? And you talked about the instrumental narrative, and you said that things have changed in Canada, but at the same time, the more things have changed, it seems like, the more instrumental that narrative is still very much there. And also, one of the things that we've seen is that given that instrumental narrative that's been very historic in Canada, because it's a country built on that whole economic integration to build the country. And also at the same time to keep people out. At the same time, we've seen people's health decline over time as we've seen the healthy immigrant effect. And I guess the question would be a broad one. What do you see, or maybe talk a little bit more about the role of digital tech and technology in sort of mitigating that gap, particularly related to the complexity of health needs and how they're actually connected and related to that narrative that we're seeing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, many things to say. Well, first of all, yeah, I think, for instance, health is not sufficiently present in the narrative. We heard it a bit during COVID, but then it was forgotten how much immigration is important for the healthcare system, because many people who work in the healthcare system are immigrants, and even Canada is recruiting actively abroad for its health system. At the same time, when we spoke about the resilience of the system, I think it was more the resilience of the people, of the individual people who had to navigate a huge crisis like that of COVID and show as much resilience as they could and overcome even their own smaller family crisis or individual crisis to make society and the system work. I think we shouldn't lose the opportunity that, as I said, the COVID brought to have a broader view of healthcare needs and emphasize the importance of intersectionality and cultural and religious aspects in providing healthcare. And I know that in Canada we have a lot of work on this in terms of how do you, for instance, Canada did better than many other countries in terms of vaccine uptake among communities, because it had a lot of programs where there were kind of ambassadors, younger people who would go out in their community and inform people and build that trust. At the same time, I think we're almost at the risk of going full circle and sometimes creating these categories of that if you are from that ethnic community, you'll be having diabetes. So your GP asks you every 2 months, how is your, so that it almost becomes a stigmatizing. So we need more. And the other thing is, I was recently also following a seminar by some colleagues at TMU who do related work. And they were showing how sometimes our very Canadian sensitive protocols are so culturally insensitive. And I could relate to that also as a new Canadian, that sometimes you go to whatever, the hospital or the GP, and I don't know, they need to, say, measure your pressure, etc. And they will say, is it okay to touch you? And obviously you have to say yes, because otherwise how are they going? But sometimes they will say the most odd things. Actually, these colleagues were showing it was about a young mother who is a refugee. That was the study, like young mothers who are refugees and access the healthcare system, and they're asked questions about their intimate life and about sexual partners, and they are like, "I'm not going to talk to you. Bye. I'm leaving." And you're asking, so I'm thinking, where is this cultural sensitivity going almost full circle? Because by trying to be sensitive, you're being so insensitive. So this is an issue for me. And then coming to technology, I think there it's both a boon and a bun, because technology can help us get into the remote communities. It can help us with telehealth. It can help us with, for instance, providing much more, for instance, mental health support also during COVID, but afterwards, there's more capacity when you use technology. But is it the same as meeting a person? And I think that's where we need to find the right balance in health, like in other services. How much you need some, for instance, first instance emergency support through technology, so through whatever, Zoom or other platform, or or sending your health records online so that it's quicker, faster, more efficient. But at the same time, you need to see a medical practitioner. And for instance, I'm also aware of the other problem, that health records are very private records, and someone might not want their employer to see them, or even their family to see them. And how do you make sure that this trust exists and this data stewardship exists? When even, I don't know about you, but when it comes to data, I'm not very skillful. So, and it hadn't occurred to me, because maybe I had trust in the system that it's okay. I was thinking it's sending anything over email is okay. But then when you're confronted with those cases where it's very sensitive, how do you deal with that? How do you use technology to create secure but simple systems?
Thank you so much. I just have a question actually in follow-up. Is that okay? Or should we just go right? Just in follow-up to that, Anna, you mentioned that approximately 500K would be going into technology, investing in technology. And does the immigration policy or immigration IRCC Canada, how much of that work is being done in immigration and health tech? Yeah.
Good question. I don't know how much. I know right now IRCC is preparing to change their main platform, in which for all of us who came to Canada, our data are in there. So I hope they don't mess it up, because it's, can't remember what it's called. It's, I think, the case load managing system. I think it's called CMS. And this will be migrated to a new system. So, and of course, there is a need for a much more modern system, in the sense that they are saying, they've updated their existing system, but at this point it has hit a level where they need a new system. The question that arises, again, as I said, about data stewardship, is about how much technology you need to facilitate to make decisions faster and more efficient. And to give you an example, in the past, 20, 30 years ago, Canada had visa officers all around the world. And when you applied for permanent residency, and I'm really talking like 25 years ago, not 55 years ago. So you would go to your nearest capital city, because it might not be in your own country, and have an interview with the person, the visa officer. That interview would be your language exam. So if you spoke good English or good French, and they would assess your skills and qualifications. Of course, you would present your skills and qualifications, but the visa officer had a role to play, even in saying, because at the time there was no educational credential assessment and there was not such standardized system. So there had been also a system developed with local experts that would say, you know, a polytechnic so-and-so is good enough to be equivalent with that. So there was a level of person-to-person and a level of discretion and very low levels of technology, and that was all happening decentralized. Through the years now, most of these things happen in Sydney, Nova Scotia, where the big processing center of IRCC is. As you know, we give language tests that are managed by a third party, sent to our file. And recently, it was, I think, two and a half years ago, we discovered that IRCC case processing officers had developed a specialized Excel sheet that was kind of helping make the decisions. So it was not creative artificial intelligence, but it was saying, so for instance, we're both women, we're both white, we both have a university degree, we both have 2 children, so my case is likely to be approved because your case was approved. So I tick those boxes. And then this was discovered because there were some contradictory decisions, and I believe the case is still in courts. And we know that IRCC is also implementing an AI system for the so-called secure cases of visa applications. So about 1/3 of visa applications today in Canada is processed through this system. Now, I want to say that because we've had a couple of grad students that worked on that, we couldn't find many flaws. It is a very pondered system. There's, you know, every X case is looked at by a human. If there's something odd, like there's a lot of safeguards, and we had even interviews with the people who work on it, and they said, you know, it's hard because the engineers think in one way and the governance people think in a different way. But the thing is, these systems will become more and more. So initially that was implemented only for visas from China and India, because this is a high number of visas. Now it's implemented in all the countries. And also one problem is that when now a case manager receives a file, they know it was not in the top 30%, because the top 30%, the secure ones, were processed by the AI. So even that tells you something. Now, should we do away with efficiency or do away with technology? No, but the chances are high. I don't know how much of these 500 million are invested in healthcare, and probably they were not in the data that I looked at, because they are in the data on the healthcare system. But I know, for instance, again, some colleagues who work in the healthcare sector were trying to put together a project that would, again, bring together engineers with health scientists and social scientists to look into this so-called portable health records. We know the uptake is very low in Canada and still is low in other countries that have tried to use it. And we know there's something about the technology being complex, and there's something about people not knowing enough about it. But we also know the fact that, for instance, particularly for children, we don't have, particularly for refugee children, but also for migrant children, children may be over-vaccinated because they couldn't prove they had the vaccinations, or they may not have access to very simple, for you, health professional stuff that relates to a condition, because they couldn't translate, you know, one record to another. And even it's like, I think my English is pretty good, but if it came to, you know, translate one medical term for another, I don't know how I would do it. So there again, for instance, in Canada, we have interpretation in many languages. AI can help with that. I'm not sure if it is used in the healthcare system, you know, automated interpretation, for instance.
Yeah, it's a big question, and I guess it'll be interesting to see what role AI plays in terms of not just immigration policy, but shifting that narrative, particularly around the bottleneck issues that you talked about, and the role of the settlement sector, and the fact that the settlement sector is reliant on steady funding. And if AI and technology is going to have such a vital role, how do we be proactive there, knowing what we know? So I think with that opening, maybe we can open it up to the floor.
Sure. Thank you. I'm Jay Shaw, a member of the project team and assistant professor at University of Toronto. Thank you so much, Anna, for that overview of the immigration system and some of its consequences in Canada. It was really helpful. So thank you. My question is sort of at a high level, but I guess partly the dialogue that we're having here is about technologies that help to deliver services or administer policy functions, like we've sort of outlined toward the tail end of your talk. And the technologies that deliver those are connected to or come from a global digital technology industry. I was just reading this week that 7 of the 8 largest companies in the world by market capitalization are technology companies headquartered in the United States. And the technologies produced by these companies scale so quickly, and they have this really sort of drastic global impact. And I guess my question for you is what observations you've made about how those technologies, as they scale and become used internationally, influence immigration activities around the world? How are technologies actually contributing to shaping the global flows of people around the world?
Oh, definitely, that's a very good question. Well, I think, of course, yeah, what that comes from some research we've been doing on decision making under crisis, and initially it was still during COVID, so we wanted to see, because we tend to think, again, asylum seekers face uncertainty, and we think highly skilled migrants don't, and COVID was one example where we all faced huge uncertainty, and some were trapped at destination and some at origin, some in transit. Sometimes families were separated or families were stuck together. Grandparents were visiting and then they couldn't leave. So what we have found is that people now are much more proactive in searching for information, and they will combine traditional sources of information like websites of the state or of visa consultants or of settlement organizations with Facebook groups, with Reddit communities more recently. You probably know there's a Reddit community which is called Ask Immigration in Canada, another one called Ask a Canadian. And we're looking into how people are using those communities and whether, because Reddit is different from Facebook and other type of social media because you don't have a profile, so you're anonymous. And some early findings that we have is that people tend to take it off the platform. So we connect through the community because I ask a question and you're providing answers, and I say, and you say, message me, and I can tell you more about what you're trying to find. So we see a lot of positive things, different ways of interacting. As I was saying, for instance, Facebook now among the younger generation is not very much used. But we know that globally, Facebook is the platform that has most users and that still people use. We know in many countries, WhatsApp is like a social media and people are on lists and they circulate information. So technologies have opened up a lot of proactive agentic possibilities for people to search for information. At the same time, we also see that this does not suffice. So again, if we take the example of international students, we know there's been a whole system of brokerage of intermediaries. There are often 3 levels of intermediaries. So the college hires someone here, who hires someone in India, who hires someone in the smaller city in India. And I would even dare say that what this person right there says, which is not accurate, is perhaps not even out of bad faith. They have no clue what is happening in Canada. So it's almost a broken telephone, but it's a big business because all these people are being paid. So the colleges and the universities are paying, but also these families are paying. And it's a whole big business sector. So, and there, while you would think that having audiovisual material would bring more accuracy, we know this is not the case. And again, studies that have been done, particularly in India on these centers or in Nepal, you see this very sleek executive centers with beautiful computers projecting, beautiful images of these, highly skilled young people making their careers in Canada and elsewhere, which are not truth. And then that invites us to think about, how we tend to think of any video as factual truth just because it's a video, but it's often taken completely out of context. So I suppose we know technology is both good and bad. The third thing I just want to say is what has changed is particularly social media. There's something about social media which make them both immediate and mediated. Immediate because the moment I write something, it's gone out and I cannot take it back. So if I wrote something that I regret, even if I delete my post, it has taken a life of its own. And at the same time, when I write something about Nancy and people like Nancy, I don't have her in front of me. So unfortunately, it seems to facilitate people writing very rude and very extreme things because this immediacy of the presence, they wouldn't say this in a classroom, they wouldn't say this in a workplace, but they put it out there. And that, of course, sometimes can have pro-social, how can I say, impact. We've seen people mobilizing, if you remember 10 years ago for Gezi Park in Istanbul, against the big development plan and siding up with youth. We've seen this with Arab Spring in 2011 and all of us mobilizing for change in the Middle East. We've seen it with, Canadians mobilizing to bring more Afghans. If you remember in the election of 2021, saying the government should do more. But unfortunately, we've seen it more mobilizing in antisocial ways for hate speech, for, denigrating, racialized people and, using it in all sorts of ways in negatively. And I'm really very concerned about what is happening in the US, but not only in the US. We've seen the power of social media in India in, favoring aggressive forms of Hindu nationalism. I don't know Russian, but what I believe is happening right now, the information that Russian people have through Telegram and their social media is not the same that we have. And how do we make these spheres, and I'm not saying we have the right and they have the wrong information, how do we make these spheres communicate with one another? Because suddenly we're globalized, but in our bubbles.
Hi, Anna. Thank you so much for this really deeply and informative conversation. So nice to see you. My name is Vanessa. I'm a clinician at the Crossroads Clinic here at Women's College, which is a clinic for newcomers. And I'm also a doctoral candidate. I'm really interested in the influence of health workforce integration related to economic improvement, as you spoke about. And particularly for internationally educated nurses, do you see any pairing that the government is interested in looking at for digital technology that can align and pair and match for IENs that really look at the economic improvement in population health? And because as you spoke to, there's a lot of different wayfinding and like cultural brokers that do a lot of this work independently, and people piece and match it all together. And I'm wondering about how you see government really looking at digital technology to really harness what's happening on the ground.
I'm afraid I don't see the government harnessing particularly technologies in this respect. And I think there's a lot of innovative elements that come from the ground up rather than from top down. And perhaps the best way would be to have them meet with one another. I think one element that, right now I believe the federal and the provincial governments are looking into for instance, the qualifications assessment using more of standardization and trying to standardize and create such systems so we minimize the level of retraining and credentialing that people need to do once they have arrived. The other element that I think has been pointed out by quite a bit of research where newcomers speak themselves and they say, for instance, couldn't I do part of this while I was still at origin? So I remember we were doing this particular study on newcomers engagement in digital platforms like Uber and similar. And we were looking into a lot of different things and also trying to understand the extent to which it can be a stepping stone to while you retrain for your profession, or it becomes a trap. Anyhow, and I remember this pharmacist from Egypt who said, you know, I came here, it's been a long process, a very expensive one, and I have to Uber to survive with my family, while if I could do at least the 12 months of this process in Cairo, and then come here, that would be a lot better. And if I had full information about what was needed. So these are some things, so we now can have a lot of advanced level of training that can happen through interactive. We know it's been used, for instance, in language learning. And again, we know it's not the same, because when people do these language courses from home, they don't have the coffee chat that we normally have when we're in a room, so they don't exercise as much. But how can we mix the two? I think that's where we need to do more work. Again, unfortunately, I think the area where there's most investment is this idea that you could do better credentialing through using technology. But I don't see other initiatives.
Thank you. So we have a question from one of our online attendees. It says, it sounds like immigration policy is largely federal jurisdiction, while health policy and programs are largely provincial. Does this present challenges for synergistic programs? And if so, how might this be overcome?
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes, definitely. I have to say, for me also, when I came to Canada in 2019 and I asked the HR at TMU about how do I get the access to a GP and how the whole system works. And I just couldn't, the previous, 12 years we had lived in Italy, and there is a GP system, it's slightly different, but there's no walk-in clinics. And for me, it was like, so if there's a walk-in clinic, why do I even need a GP? And how do I get a GP? And what is this about the waiting, list and all that? And then even finding that Service Ontario and Service Canada are two different things. That was also very confusing. And then finding that, healthcare is Service Ontario, likewise your driver's license, but your SIN is Service Canada. And often these two places are housed in the same building. So then you're like, what am I? So I think, it is a bit of a disconnect. And I sometimes also, so when I do this translation between colleagues in Europe and colleagues here, I say, okay, think of the provinces like the member states of the European Union, more or less. So the systems are connected, they are standardized, but they're also different. So, and of course it reflects also historical realities of the different provinces. I think it is an issue. I think right now, there is a certain level, and provinces like Ontario, British Columbia, and I believe Quebec too, are probably at the forefront of developing this connection between the federal and the provincial, because precisely the healthcare system is provincial, immigration is mostly federal. As I explained, the provincial nominee is provincial, but the provinces realize that they have to step up a bit, particularly when it comes to integrating people. And sometimes even almost beyond the federal mandate, as I was saying, with regard to providing support services to temporary migrants. And I think probably the best connection can happen if it focuses on specific areas, because maybe a connection of the federal and the provincial overall might be more difficult. But for instance, the healthcare sector provides an opportunity for a kind of close connection.
Go ahead, Ibukun. I realize we're over time,
Yes,
so you probably want to say something.
Yeah, and I've just been told that lunch is ready, so I won't keep people waiting. But I just had one question for Anna, and thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. There was one of your slides where you had talked about the fact that privately sponsored refugees are faring better than those who are publicly sponsored. And I wanted to extend that a bit to the fact that we're also seeing that settlement organizations are taking on a brunt of the work that we expected the government to do. However, they remain under-resourced and not, properly capacitated to do the work. So because of that, you have people falling between the system and between the cracks, and there's not that much coherence. In our role as scholars and activists and advisors, how do you think we can help connect those dots to handle what is obviously a clear need, but seems to be very fragmented?
Yeah, a good question. Well, I think initiatives as this one, and I think many others that we're all doing are very important, which bring the practice and the research together. Because oftentimes in the research, we have the broader picture, but we don't know the actual challenges. Often the difference between the letter of the policy and how the policy is implemented on the ground and what comes as a feedback from the ground. And sometimes people, I work less with health institutions, I work more with civil society institutions. They see their immediate problem, but they don't see the bigger, so how can we address this beyond solving the specific challenge of the specific organization? How can we address this at a broader level? So certainly this is, a responsibility that we have. At the same time, for instance, I think the case of the refugees in the private and publicly sponsored, and I had written in the slides, there's also a system called blended visa, which brings the two together. It's tiny, it's like 1,000 people. And for instance, Canada, in Canada, because they realized, particularly after the arrival of people from Syria and a huge uptake of the private sponsorship, the private sponsors needed support because they needed to understand very well what they're engaging in. Because some private sponsorships kind of fell apart. And that actually I know there are some settlement organizations that run kind of basic training. If you want to become a private sponsor, you go to this training, and also because they found that it could become very paternalistic towards the newcomers. But at the same time, I think it's a very good opportunity to look at the pros and cons of each system and find a good balance, because obviously the state should be responsible for the newcomers, but we can all make a difference. And I think we shouldn't throw this out of the window because we say, oh, the state should be responsible, because at the end of the day, the state is us.
I think that says it well. The state is us. Really a privilege to hear you today and your insights on how we can be morally and ethically responsible and how we can enact that. Thank you very much. And I think we'll just close on that note for lunch.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you very much.
So we're going to break for lunch. We can try to be back at 12:45, so we have an early start, which helps me keep my promise to get us out the door in time to watch the eclipse. All right. Dietary restrictions, if you indicated, you would have your box with your name labeled on it. So just watch out for that. Thank you. Enjoy lunch, and please feel free to network and connect with people you don't know.
inside. Can't control the way I feel. Can't control the way I feel inside. Never gonna let you. Never gonna let you get away. Never gonna let you. Never gonna let you get away.
Okay. Welcome everyone back from lunch, which is always very difficult to follow on. But someone said to me, imagine that we're now filled up and we're paying attention to you. So I'm going to hold on to that energy and imagine everyone is paying attention. So the idea is over the next 45 minutes to an hour to walk you through the journey of how we got here. Like, why did we decide to plan the event? And I've, in side conversations, had to explain, like, why did we say beyond technology, beyond healthcare? Like, what's the gist behind that? And that's what I'm going to share today. How something that started as an exploration into an initial idea about technology moved to conversations about healthcare and caused us to come to the recognition that we need to go even beyond those two silos. So my name is Ibukun Abejirinde. Again, it's been a pleasure to host you and have you here at this event. I'm a scientist at Trillium Health Partners, Institute for Better Health. I'm an adjunct scientist here at Women's College Hospital, and I also have an appointment at the University of Toronto in the Dalalana School of Public Health. So where did this journey begin? September 2022, I was thinking about what the pandemic had meant for people who had come into the country during the pandemic and had to grapple with the fact that Canada's healthcare system meant that you had to connect with your physician or whoever you wanted to see remotely because of public health mandates. And I was wondering, well, for people where the country is an entirely new experience, then the modality of healthcare is also an entirely different experience. What does that mean for compassion and compassionate care? So we decided to go on this study that was generously supported by AMS Healthcare to understand, does virtual care meet the needs and expectations of newcomers and immigrants to Canada for compassionate care? And if it does so, how does it do so? And so, like I explained, this happened within the context of the pandemic. And I think critical to why we decided to focus the inquiry on immigrants and refugees is because even though virtual care, which is essentially being able to receive healthcare services remotely, and the two most dominant forms that were used during the pandemic were telephone and video, even though that was widespread and it was well recognized as being able to support remote care such that people didn't need to come into the hospitals for their follow-up visits or whatever it was, evidence started to emerge to show that people from structurally marginalized communities were experiencing this ubiquitous technology differently. And the rationale to explain that was because of the barriers to care that have nothing to do with the individual, but have much more to do with the institutes and the systems and the structures and policy that guard healthcare. And so we wanted to really understand, using like a health equity focused anchored lens, how does it work for this particular population, and what can we do to better support virtual care, just given the fact that this is going to be the new form of healthcare. So what we did is we decided to do a scoping review to synthesize knowledge globally, where we're looking for elements of narratives that could speak to the intersections between newcomer healthcare services and the extent to which it was compassionate. And we're being mindful here to recognize that the word compassion may not be explicitly used in the literature, but we're curious to see how other people were explaining, or what words they were using to explain or justify how they were meeting newcomers wherever they wanted to be. The second thing we did was we partnered very graciously, and I'm very thankful for that, with 3 newcomer and refugee serving organizations, Crossroads Clinic, which is domiciled here at Women's College Hospital, Access Alliance, as well as FCJ Refugee Center. And so through those connections and contacts and initiating the process and explaining the inquiry and building trust, we had the opportunity to interview 25 patients with different migration pathways from these 3 service providing institutions, as well as the providers who were delivering care to them. And the goal there was to explore from the patient's perspective and the provider's perspective, how was their experience or perception of virtual care, and did they think it was compassionate? So interviews were about 45 minutes, And the eligibility criteria was that they had to have received or provided at least one virtual care visit since March 2020, which is like the official start time for the pandemic. Keep in mind that these interviews were now being conducted in late 2022. One thing that was crucial, and probably this is what landed us in the bucket, was we decided that we didn't just want to hear their experiences from a very phenomenological perspective. We wanted to use intersectionality as a way to really understand the nuances that could explain their experiences. And here we were sort of drawing from the fact that as a lens, intersectionality could help us identify how power relations and how societal identities could explain the way individuals walk through life or experience services, and how it explains complexity in the way we move through and experience the world. So on this figure, you will see a guiding lens that we use, which is a well-known framework called intersectionality-based policy analysis. And there we were trying to analyze the data across multiple levels with an equity-focused lens, being very mindful of power relations, being reflexive of the data and of ourselves, because interestingly, the entire research team was made up of first or second generation immigrants and refugees. We're looking at things with temporality in mind as well, which became very critical to our findings. And we wanted to ground our analysis and the way we were reporting it with a social justice lens, amongst others. So I am not going to present the details of the research study, but I'm sort of going to spin off to then show how it led us and landed us in sort of like a different bucket. But I wanted to present the slides to just share that I think this graphic sort of summarizes what we did find. So when you look at patient experiences, coming into a new country and context where care was being delivered virtually, their expectations of healthcare really shaped what they thought they were going to receive. Keep in mind that from a cultural perspective, many cultures do not see a digital modality as a way of healthcare service delivery, right? Okay, I can call you on the phone to schedule an appointment. I can call you on the phone to ask a few questions or call for directions, but if I'm having a clinical encounter, it needs to be in person. So their past experiences from their home country shaped what they thought healthcare was going to be. But then there was often conflict. All the people we spoke to said in Canada was the first time they had a full physician visit squarely on the telephone or on a video. And that was very jarring. It wasn't expected. It wasn't the stories they had imagined or been told about what healthcare in Canada looks like. So that was something that, I mean, in reflection, we realized that from an action perspective, people need to be eased into what is healthcare, at least in the Canadian context. Then there were structural factors. In some cases, virtual care did increase access to specific groups of newcomers and migrants. But as we looked at the data, we saw that the people who were confirming its value for access were those who were highly educated, came from predominantly white countries, had permanent resident status, or came in through like the sponsorship or economic pathway. But those who have precarious status, temporary status, who had early on coming to Canada, who were from African or Middle Eastern countries, and who were Black identifying, had less access to virtual care. And we're trying to understand that, and I'll explain what we found later on. We also saw that people were stumbling into healthcare. So when we asked them, how did you connect first with the service provider? We had stories where they would say, you know, I was walking in the park, I was feeling so frustrated, I saw a lady on a bench, I sat down, we started chatting, I told her my problems, I'm looking for a physician. She said, why don't you try this place? That's how they got into healthcare. And I think now hearing Anna's presentation where she said that only 10% of people who are eligible for newcomer information and support actually use it, it's beginning to make more sense. There was one particular person who said they went to a Tim Hortons, and while they were queuing up in the line, they saw somebody who looked like them and was speaking their home country language. And they went to them, introduced themselves and say, you know, I just came to this country, this is what I'm looking for, blah, blah, blah. And they wrote, the way they described it was so vivid in my head, it's like I was there. They wrote on a paper towel the name of Women's College Hospital Crossroads Clinic, and that's how they got care. So it's like this thing of people accessing care through informal networks, and I think it made us realize that not enough credit or data is being pulled to show the value of these newcomer networks. And to that point, from a disadvantage or a barrier perspective, is the fact that there is not enough knowledge being shared about how to formally navigate the healthcare system and the social system. For those who have undocumented status or don't have permanent housing, for them to get a SIM card to be able to use on a phone where you can call them for the appointment, that was difficult. Because when you go into a phone place, then they ask you for your SIN or your credit card or something to identify you. And if you are someone with precarious status, then that's a very difficult conversation to have. We also found that virtual care was not appropriate for everybody, right? So the narrative is it's everywhere, it's for everyone, it reaches all barriers, geographic at least. But we did find that for those who were newcomers who didn't really understand how the healthcare system worked, and those who had mental health challenges, some of which was actually acquired or started in Canada, virtual care was not the most appropriate. And then there were other things about convenience and language and relationality, and I won't go into the details, but just to give you an idea of where we're coming from. But now, the issue with research that they don't always teach you is that when you're doing research, if you're lucky, you get to find what you're looking for. If you're even more lucky, you find what you're not looking for, but then you've opened a Pandora's box. And from a social accountability perspective, from a transparency perspective, like once you see it, you can't ignore it, you can't unsee it. And so what we started seeing, there was one question we asked, and we said, how did you feel when from your first conversation with the reception, they told you that you were going to have this meeting with your physician on the telephone or through a video call? And people used the word, I was afraid, I was scared, I was anxious, I wasn't sure if I wanted to take the appointment. And we thought in the research team, I'm like, okay, it's just why? What is the reason and rationale for that fear? And so we now started to see, as we had more interviews and looked through the data with intersectionality, that their experiences and the way they were describing their expectations and experience of virtual care was linked to systemic and social issues that had to do with axes of privilege and oppression. We started seeing that what we thought was, how do you feel about virtual care? And tell us about your virtual care experience, was shaped by factors that had nothing to do with virtual care at all. And that's where the beyond technology part of this conversation came from. We found that when we talked to people who came in as PR or were family sponsored, or express entry, they were highly skilled, again, what Anna had talked about. They were highly skilled, highly educated. We talked to lawyers, and they will tell you, I knew what I wanted. I was able to advocate for myself. I figured out what was what. I was able to get on the call on time. It wasn't too difficult. I didn't need a translator. But if you needed a translator, if you were undocumented, if you were Black, if you came from a Middle Eastern country, all of those things started shaping if and how you experienced your settlement journey, which was now extended to how you described your experiences with virtual care. And so we started seeing a trickle-down effect from their experiences with society at the border, started landing as symptoms at the bedside, and then it landed in our interview data. So if you do like a root cause analysis, when we talk to providers, many of whom were immigrants themselves or have been trained with a social justice, social determinant of health lens, they were going and be above and beyond to try to provide compassionate care with or without virtual care. But then they were doing it within the context of a system where power was unevenly distributed, where there were systemic inequities and structures. So someone will come in and it's about their diabetes, but it's not really about their diabetes. It's about the fact that they can't afford good food, or they don't have shelter, or they can't put their children in school, or they've been denied their claim 5 times. And so we decided to use the tree for like a metaphor of our root cause analysis to say that settlement organizations and healthcare providers and social workers were trying to water the system from the branches. However, we needed to start watering from the roots. And so the social determinants of health became a way of explaining if and how newcomers experience virtual care compassionately. But again, there was limited resources and capacity for providers to do that, which then led to provider burnout and fatigue. So in our narratives, we started shifting from individual experience of compassion to asking questions about what are we doing to ensure that the system itself is compassionate? Because if the system at its root is compassionate, then it's likely that everything that grows out of it or comes out of it could be compassionate. Virtual care, we also noticed, because of this benefit of distance, actually had a disadvantage of shifting how much space a patient could take up. So people told us that when I'm in the room with my physician, I feel like they hear me more because they're seeing me as I am, they're looking into my eyes, they're reading my body language. I feel like I can advocate, negotiate, and ask questions better. But if I'm on the phone, the patient says, I can't see them. I'm not sure if that was a background noise or it was a sigh. Were they paying attention to me? Was there a distraction? The patient cannot really contextualize the fullness of the encounter, as well as the provider. So there were a lot of blind spots in the relationship of the encounter that patients shared and expressed with us, made them feel disempowered. But that doesn't change the fact that at the same time, they also felt it was convenient and it gave them access, but that tended to happen after the fact. One healthcare provider said to us, I think sometimes these conversations amount to us talking about clinical approaches to being compassionate. But then if the structures are not there to pay for people's medications, for their access to shelter, for home care, to get the tests that they need, then how compassionate are we being really? So our root cause analysis identified unequal power distribution, the social determinants of health, systemic inequities, racism and social bias. There was fragmentation between healthcare and social system. So what manifested as the bedside as a health issue, we found, if we traced it and through conversations, was actually a social issue that was just symptomatic. Like you could tell that if you solved for the social issue, you probably will not be seeing the patient that often. We also, from the narratives, identified this burnout of the system where providers explained, we're doing the best we can, but it doesn't seem like it's enough because the demand and the need is just so high. That being said, there's also the positive spin to things that are green and growing at the root. We did identify that organizations were putting in a lot of work and energy into advocating for change. We understood and came to terms with community resilience, particularly from community health organizations that are serving newcomer populations and had come together to sort of join forces, encourage and support each other, even within the context of limited resources. This is a quote from a patient who was sharing the fact that she's been struggling to have access to care for her kids, the precarity she's faced moving into Canada as an African female immigrant has actually led to mental health issues. She said it's because the systems have been really not just hard, but also the fact that we feel discrimination. We felt that something that everybody who has status has been able to get or who has benefits, we cannot get it. I'm the only one in my family who is supposed to not have mental health issues. But it's really hard to be in this position as a mother and a wife. It's not been easy. And when I spoke about this, people said to me, oh my gosh, that is so unfair. Because it's supposed to be that the systems are working, that they are working for good. It's supposed to be that Canada has the best interest for our children, but that's not true because they're not able to see my kids. A healthcare provider shared with us about this challenge with trying to water a tree from the branches. There are many things I would like to talk about with my patient's life, but I can't because there's just so many number of patients I can see in a day. Otherwise, the hospital could tell me, you're not seeing enough patients, so how do we fund you? and then your whole schedule becomes packed because there are other people that are waiting and they have more concerns, and you have to address all those concerns in 30 minutes with a language interpreter. There's this pressure, this feeling of having to hurry, and I hate that approach. I don't like it. I don't feel it's a good way for me to be a good nurse or a good person if I can't provide that care. But at the same time, I realize it's not me personally, it's the system. It's the fact that primary care is currently like this and our clinic needs funding. There are times where I personally feel so heavy with everyone's symptoms and traumas. There are days when my mind doesn't work or my heart doesn't work because it's just full of stories. I find that being present for a particular patient will make it difficult. And then I realize I need to take a mental health day. These are personal, these are systemic, and these are patient-specific. So summarily, when we unpack the layers with intersectionality, our study findings showed, in one sense, the benefits of virtual care, the opportunities, the challenges, and which groups had challenges with accessing it compassionately. But it also shows that the challenges that newcomers faced extended beyond healthcare. So that's where the other half of the dialogue tag came from. That these challenges are deeply rooted in structural and systemic level factors, which span both the settlement sector and the healthcare system, although we did find in the narratives and conversation that it seems that they were very disjointed. So we had structural values, structural issues, systemic issues, institutional level issues such as policies or behaviors on, who can you see, when can you see them, how much time can you give to a patient. And then there was obviously the interpersonal issues, which people experience either on the bus or in the park or walking on the street or at the border or trying to seek shelter, whatever it was. So the lack of well-rounded and integrated health and social supports for newcomers negatively impacted patients, eventually had an impact on healthcare providers who then felt they had to go the extra mile to bridge the gaps between what the patient needs and what is available from a systems perspective. And the reality is no technology or virtual care can bridge these gaps. And one of our main study conclusions is that compassionate care is equity in action. So beyond technology, I think there's now this narrative with the propagation of virtual care and digital technology and AI and all these complex things, even though virtual care could act as a bridge such that newcomers, particularly those who eventually got comfortable with feeling more settled in Canada, could access healthcare, we also saw that it could serve as a wall disconnecting patients and providers from building a good relationship. And having that therapeutic relationship is actually central to having an experience of good quality care. So within the landscape of technological growth, there's also now this extreme of techno-solutionism, which is we're going to fix everything as long as we build a technology around it. And that is now leading to an issue where we may be trading off the realities that these are complex social problems, that no matter how complicated the technology is, it's actually even more exclusive than inclusive in trying to solve for the problems. So what we want to do through these dialogues is to break away from the danger of a single solution and recognize that we may not be able to solve everything, and our job is not for one person or any one person to solve everything, but at least to come to terms with and confront the fact that this is a complex issue. It's going to take more than one solution. Solutions may reinforce or cancel out each other. But if we do it collaboratively and we draw from different lenses, disciplines, and experiences, we're more likely to move the needle forward in an equitable and integrated way. Overall, social and healthcare factors are interdependent and they're reinforcing. And so we need to bring that together because what we're seeing is people are being forced to choose. It's like, do you want social care or do you want healthcare? Like, where do you want to go? And we don't think it needs to be split. I think it needs to be the same because they are all interconnected. One of the healthcare providers said, I think there's a role for virtual care that could be very unique and effective with this population. And we're particularly talking about undocumented immigrants. There are probably many people out there who are not able to show up physically or would not show up because of fear of persecution, but they would show up for a phone call or a video call. And maybe that's the way to expose them to their first interactions with the healthcare system so that they can build trust and rapport. I think one of the things that was key from this study and from this quote is that we saw that even if society pre-contact with healthcare system broke their belief in Canada and what it had to offer, when they went back to settlement service, when they eventually got to settlement service organizations, which unfortunately happened like 8 months, 1 year after they got into the country, they were able to build that trust again through the service they received, which they believed was largely compassionate. And then that was able to repair their trust and their hopes in what the system could offer them. So I think there's something to be said about the fact that it's all not lost. There's a way to fix it, but maybe we won't need to fix it if the problem didn't exist in the first place. So we saw that virtual care could play a role in building trust and rapport, especially with non-status individuals. And we saw that in any case, if people needed to choose, when someone is trying to go for a job, the last thing on their mind is taking the TTC to go downtown or anywhere else to stay in a waiting room for 30 to maybe 2 hours waiting to see a physician, because every second counts. Like, their first priorities are, I get housing, I get a job, then I can feel more settled. And so virtual care allowed them to continue to pursue those dreams in trying to settle down quickly by having a phone call and not having to take public transportation. So during the context of social isolation, I think this is important to mention, and we're going to talk a bit more about this tomorrow as well as in the subsequent events in May, is that within the context of social isolation, we saw that mental and emotional health of everybody really, but then even of newcomers, was greatly impacted. And so virtual care was not the right, most appropriate modality for those kind of people, because it was almost like a slippery slope. Once they went downhill, they felt isolated. Having that telephone connection was not satisfactory. A patient said to us, even though we'll be on the phone, sometimes I don't know if she knows this, so she being the person's provider. At some point, I intentionally stopped picking the phone calls because I was tired. I was like, why am I going through this? Because I can't see this provider. I did not meet her at all. Whenever you're done, let them tell me. I don't care, I'm done. This patient eventually told us during the interviews that she was fine before she came to Canada. She had applied and filed her claim. She had been denied multiple times. The pandemic happened. She fell into depression, started having mental health challenges, and the relationship with her provider just broke down to almost zero, even though she had had a good experience prior. A patient said to us that sometimes I will come to see my provider, and if my shirt is inside out, or maybe I didn't comb my hair, or maybe I haven't eaten for a long time, she would look at me and she would know that something was wrong. But on the phone, how are you going to look at me? You only observe my voice, and that's it. And so all of these cues, the encounter was more than just them reporting symptoms. For the patient, it meant you had to see all of me, and that was lost in translation with virtual care. Newcomers told us that they had problems with, I think I went backward here. Yes. When we anchored our findings within the lens of intersectionality, we heard how their challenges extended beyond healthcare and were deeply rooted in all of this systemic and structural level factors. Problems related with integration, inability to find housing, inability to find employment, inability to get their refugee claims prolonged or it was denied, or some of them faced threats of deportation. And so providers in the interview shared with us that all of these things and the precarity reinforced itself and started manifesting as physical and mental health stressors. And once that sets in, then the ability of virtual care to sort of bridge that gap in connecting to the patient, it just diminished significantly. So while the broader upstream factors were central to these needs and they were recognized by providers recognized that they didn't have all the supports that they needed. A Palestinian PR patient shared with us in the interviews that it doesn't seem like the provincial government or even the federal government really cares about us. And this comes back to us as the citizens or patients. So you've brought in people who have good education, but the problem is that the system is failing them. This is my impression over the years since I've been interacting with the healthcare industry. One of the most powerful quotes I remember is the person I was describing earlier, who was an African refugee claimant, middle-aged, and had developed mental health issues because she had had problems with her claim, finding housing. She had a very traumatic entry into Canada because when she came in, the refugee shelters were filled up. She went to the general population shelter, and there she was physically and verbally abused to the point where she had to leave the shelter and sleep on the streets instead in the winter. So it was like, I would rather die in the streets than be subjected to this abuse. She eventually found a space in the refugee shelter. The refugee shelter luckily had a connection to a primary care clinic. That's how she saw a physician. She started having appointments, built a good relationship, and then the pandemic broke, and then she was suddenly only able to access her primary care provider on the phone. And then she said to me, people heal differently. Different people could heal with seeing, or they heal with touching, or they heal with being listened to. At first on the phone, my provider will call my name, but then it started reducing. And she will say my name. You don't talk like you used to. What do you want me to say? Do you understand? When I would go in person, I will sit. She will see my emotions. She will see me. But then on the phone, she would say my name. I feel like you're not here. Are you there? It was fake. There was no emotion. She cannot see me. I cannot see her. So this person eventually stopped taking calls from her provider. Note that this is someone with mental health issues. And so during the pandemic, it just got worse. So by the time we were having this interview, it was very difficult to help her see. I mean, she was in a better place, but I think we really appreciated the fact that she was willing to share that vulnerability and story with us. Beyond healthcare. So February 2024, just 3 days after arriving to Canada, and some of you may be familiar with this story, a female African immigrant, her name Delphina Ngigi, died just in 3 days. She was waiting for a bed at a shelter in Ontario. She was 46 years old. She's a mother of 4. Her 4 children she left back in her home country while she came here seeking asylum. She waited, I mean, the news reports would later share that she waited for hours outside in the cold to try and get a space in the shelter. She was eventually allowed to sleep in the lobby. The shelter was full. She collapsed the next day. She got to the hospital. She died. This is just one of many stories. Not 4 months before, another African asylum seeker had also died tragically in the cold. And one thing that was very clear was that the people who were not accessing settlement support services were the people that are racially discriminated against, marginalized in society because you don't have a particular skin color, or you don't speak a particular language, or you don't look deserving. So we saw using intersectionality that there were gross inequities even within the pool of those who were considered refugees or asylum seekers. So one of the things that we then started to question is this choice between social care, which is finding shelter or employment, and healthcare. And the question is, why does it have to be either or? Why can't it be both? Why can't there be a way that we can integrate the wholesome support that people need to be able to survive and thrive and actually settle? Because if you're walking through cracks within the system, there's no way settlement is happening. One of the papers that I was reading as part of this work shared that when you're trying to address the needs of structurally marginalized people, what you need is coordinated multi-component interventions that actually bring in the health and the non-healthcare aspects of what is needed. And it needs to be done with partnership and service design in order to achieve the most necessary results. And that's what we're hoping these conversations will get us into. Anna had mentioned this earlier about this idea of people coming in not only skilled but very healthy, where that's the healthy immigrant effect. And essentially, that is just a term that had been coined to describe that people who come and migrate, particularly for economic processes, tend to have better health and lower mortality compared with native-born populations of the high-income countries they've gone to. However, more recent research has started showing that we are now seeing a landscape change where there is a health mortality paradox. Part of the rationale to explain why newcomer health has been deprioritized in exchange for prioritizing their ability to get income and social services is because of the economic agenda, right? If we're bringing them in, we want them to get to work quickly so that it can contribute to our economic growth. After all, they're healthy, so we don't need to bother about their health. The health will come down the line. But what this new paradigm is showing, which someone coined as the health mortality paradox, is that even though immigrants appear to be living longer, they're actually living in worse healthcare conditions than the native born. And because we are assessing needs based on mortality instead of morbidity, we're actually not catching people early on time when they are ill. So they're living longer in sicker conditions. So the social determinants of health, I've mentioned that a bit, but it's so central to this work because at the end of the day, we did find that the medical issues, the concerns about virtual care perceptions and experiences were actually shaped and grounded in the social determinants of health, which is non-medical factors that research has shown influences how people experience healthcare and their healthcare outcomes. So these are the conditions in which people are born, they grow, they work, they live, and the wider forces that shape the conditions of their daily life, many of which they have no control over. So if you're thinking of income, social protection, education, food insecurity, housing, environmental conditions, discrimination, all those are social determinants of health. And we know now that these social determinants of health are more important than direct healthcare or lifestyle choices. So research has shown that the social determinants of health account for between 30 to 55% of health outcomes. So if someone is coming to you and they're presenting with something clinical, seemingly, if you took a social determinant of health lens, you will find out that the rationale or the reason behind what you need to actually solve for is more socially related than healthcare related. And the other thing is, I was then trying to say, and I was brainstorming with someone, and I said, okay, you can't do everything. Like, there are all these complex things, and there are multiple social determinants of health. If there was one thing we could shift the needle on to be able to have the greatest impact, what would it be? And it was housing, not too surprising. Because once you get in and you have shelter, not transitional, even though transitional is better than nothing, but you have stable housing, then you have an address, then you have a postal code. If you have a postal code, then you know where your kids are going to go to school, because the kids' school is linked to your postal code. And then you can go to an employer and your CV actually has an address, because if you're homeless, there's no address to put on it. And then if your name is now a name like mine or a Middle Eastern name, then your chances are even worse. But if they see that, oh, you live in this place in Toronto, you almost seems like you're more real and you're more believable. So there are these reinforcing cycles of precarity where they come in as immigrants, they're struggling to merge into the societal context. There's discrimination happening depending on what your name is and what your skin color is. That affects your ability to integrate. That affects your ability to get employment. If you get employment, it's probably that you're underemployed or you're being exploited at work because of your status. That gives you stress. That gives you mental health issues. You're probably not making enough money to pay the rent in the house you struggle to get. And it just keeps going on. And at the end of the day, it all lands into healthcare symptoms, mental health, undernutrition, chronic diseases, toxic stress. So essentially, there is an opportunity for shared impact and shared responsibility and shared outcomes, because the symptoms that that is manifesting in healthcare and social systems are actually symptoms that should be dealt with at the settlement and immigration level. There's poor integration between health and social services. There's poor navigation, because we say there's all that information out there. it doesn't mean that there's access to healthcare. So that's part of the challenge, is because, oh, there's all these pamphlets, and if you go to the website, you'll see all of them. We were even floored by how much information there was, because it was so fragmented. It's like, if you as a newcomer were trying to find your way, and they said, go to this website and Google this, you would get so lost, because I even got lost. My team got lost just trying to navigate and make sense of it. The settlement sector is actually uniquely positioned to respond to this, because they can do it like in a trauma-informed, culturally responsive way. The challenge, though, is that there's under-resourcing happening there, and there's fragmentation within other sectors that deal with these issues. So the last segment of this story, what do we do? How do we integrate pathways? Because the essence of why we then wanted to do these dialogues was, we thought that if through these conversations and events we could foster multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder discourse from academics, settlement organizations, community leaders, activists, practitioners, people with lived experience or living experience of immigration, we can then together identify practices and strategies for integrating responsive and equitable services for newcomers, which could then be used for policy and advocacy. So in advance of the dialogues, what we decided to do in partnerships with Health Common Solutions Lab, who is going to facilitate our workshops in May, is we wanted to just map the journey, right, of newcomers and kind of give it like a visual face to say, when someone comes in at the border, what are the services that they make contact with? Who do they contact? What information do they get? What services do they get? And how does it eventually land into healthcare services or whatever services? So we spoke to 3 newcomers who have different settlement pathways. We also spoke to workers and settlement organizations, and we wanted to develop this journey map. So I'll tell you stories that we spoke to one person who came in from Jamaica on a work visa to work on a farm, came in through the airport in 2017, arrived, and is currently undocumented because their work visa expired. We had a refugee, we spoke to a refugee claimant, came in from Venezuela, is currently a permanent resident, arrived in December 2018, also came in through the airport. And we spoke to another currently permanent resident, but who came in September 2019 as a refugee claimant from a sub-Saharan African country. And this is the map that we developed. And you're not supposed, I mean, I know you can't see everything, but I just wanted to show how, if you looked at this, the very dark orange spots are like immigration services. The light ones are like locations, geographic locations or processes. So it's like arriving at airport. The green ones are the places or spaces, organizations where they get healthcare. And this side of the slide is the entry point, and down there is like settlement, like months or years down the line. And so as we started plotting this journey map, we started saying, for one, this is very, very complicated. Second thing we saw, well, this is also very fragmented, and I can definitely see why people will fall through the cracks. And the third thing that stood out is healthcare happens down the line and never right up front. So these are just snapshots to sort of make you see it better, but we're not going to go into detail into this because we're carrying this journey map into the workshops that we're going to have in May. So I guess I'm just whetting your appetite for that. So on this graph, we sort of try to bring all the points together so you can make sense of the journey. So they get in through the airport, usually, and they make contact with an employer if they've been sponsored on a work visa, or they come in and they make contact with Border Patrol. Those who are refugee claimants submit their claim, they use an immigration lawyer, or they use a legal aid organization. Knowing which services are available and who to contact it could take months before you eventually get to that point. So don't be deceived by how sequential this looks. It's really not that sequential. It's just so we can make sense of it. Then you, usually at the border, especially if you're government assisted, you will get what is known as the IFHP card, which is sort of like the card that allows you access healthcare services. What people do not know, for one, is they don't even know that that card is in their welcome packet. We did speak to someone who was like, I had it. I didn't know I had it. Months later, I was complaining to someone I needed healthcare. They were like, didn't you get a package? You know, a nice big envelope. And they're like, yeah, I got it. And he's like, you should have a card there to access healthcare. And he was like, I don't have a card. It's like, you should have a card. And then he went back. Luckily, he still had the package, sifted through all the pamphlets and information booklets and everything, and found the card. So he had access, but he didn't really have access. People also do not know that the IFHP is not accepted by all healthcare providers in the province. So and nobody gives you a list of who accepts it. So you go somewhere and then you're like, sorry, they don't accept it. And you go somewhere and they don't accept it, and people just give up and they stop seeking healthcare. So you get your IFHP, you get your refugee ID, then you may or may not be connected to shelter services. And then shelter services are full. If you're lucky, you get a space. Currently in Peel Region, I think the last count, there are over 300% at capacity in shelters, and they're trying to open more because there are more asylum seekers coming in. If you're lucky, shelter will be able to assign you to an intake worker or case worker who will then provide you with like, okay, this is what you do next, and this is what you do. Keep in mind that there are just so many case workers for the many number of people who need care. And so you go through the process, you're trying to get your claim, or you're trying to convert your status. That's a lot of legal steps you're going through. You could get denied, you could get lost, you could be required to pay money, you could come into fraudulent people who are trying to make a buck off your pain. Finally, you get a work permit or not. Then you're trying to say, okay, now I have my permit, what do I need to do? I need to get a job. You're going to enroll in employment programs, many of which they're either in person or they're online. If they're online, then you need to go to the library to access them if you don't have your own laptop. So it's a whole continuous cycle of contact points. None of this is healthcare yet, but all of these contact points and how smooth or difficult they are will start leading to healthcare issues. And then by the time the person finally contacts healthcare, then there are many more problems than there actually needed to be. And healthcare, especially for those providers that are already trained and specially positioned to serve newcomers, would usually have a multidisciplinary team where there's a caseworker and there's a peer navigator and people who will then guide you through the system. So healthcare eventually is able to close the loop, but then that's not their primary job, but they're eventually able to do it. And so the question is, what if we integrated from the beginning? And that way, we would distribute resources and knowledge within a very under-resourced system. So this is just another way of just showing the journey. At the top, the positive experiences that the people we spoke to shared with us, from arrival to linkage to housing. And then at the bottom is like the things that didn't work out: long waiting time, not being able to get a translator, confusion about what services they were eligible for. On the other hand, though, they did talk about the fact that there were people who had relatively smooth experiences. Someone was able to stay at a shelter for 4 to 5 months, which is not typical, because usually the shelters want to get you out in 2 to 3 months. But now that there's also less of a supply with housing, at least stable housing, then it's becoming more the case that you find people staying on as long as the shelter will take them. Some people have the capacity of being quickly linked to community networks, to faith-based organizations that are willing to take them in, and those are then helping to sort of bridge the gaps in the system. So I'll tell you a couple of stories that we pulled from this journey map. So think of Ada, who is an undocumented resident from Guyana, a mother of 5, who came to Canada 7 years ago as a skilled farm worker. She's a sole provider for her family and was very determined to support her children's education. She then decided to leave her job working precariously in the farm to be able to move to the city and give her children a better quality of life. She also wanted to transition her visa. She reached out to a paralegal who encouraged her to apply for a refugee claim. But then someone else then said to her, well, your country is not one of the countries where you can make a refugee claim from. So she decided not to proceed with making the claim. And so she has continued to stay in the city as an undocumented resident. Unfortunately, she had a health injury and injured her wrist. And because she's afraid of getting into trouble, getting flagged in the system, getting deported, that wrist has not been attended to, and she's not seeking healthcare services. Farid is another story. Refugee claimant from Mali came to Canada 2018 seeking asylum. thoroughly interrogated when he came in through the airport by Canadian Border Police. He was referred by central intake to an overnight stay, and then he was eventually placed in a refugee shelter, and he was able to stay there for 5 months. But then they eventually had to ask him to leave because they needed room for more recent arrivals. His caseworker, he was lucky he got one, assisted him with finding stable housing and employment. Then he started attending programs and opportunities available in the community. His peers recommended that he go to a community refugee health center that was offering healthcare services and some social support. He was able to get services through the IFHP, and then he eventually got connected to legal aid and proceeded with his refugee claim. He's now a permanent resident. Mahalia, final story, permanent residents came into Canada 2019 as a visitor from Ecuador. She was hoping to find a job in Canada so that she could stay here legally, and she wanted to file a refugee claim. She got information by herself. Keep in mind, she was a reporter in her home country, so she went through social media groups, connected with her cultural community in the city, was able to connect to a lawyer, and then she started processing her refugee claim. They took her through a stringent medical examination. She was thoroughly interrogated. Her claim was approved. She got her work permit, and then she was able to start applying as a permanent resident after a while. Now that she is a permanent resident, she can now access healthcare services through the provincial plan. Not all the stories are doom and gloom, not all the stories are rosy, but at the end of the day, they are centered around real people with real lives. So the highlights comes back to this levels of opportunity to identify gaps and solve for the system. There are individual level barriers, there are institutional level and barriers, there are community level and barriers, and there are policy level and barriers. And the conversations we're going to be having tomorrow and then again in May are going to try to talk about these different barriers, talk about the possibilities for integration and connection, talk about what needs to be done to strengthen them, and how that ends up in policy and action. So that's essentially what we're going to be doing, and we're very happy that you decided to come on this journey with us. We're setting up a website where we will be archiving the recordings and content and the contributions from the dialogues. People are connecting online and engaging in this conversation. So yes, we are hopeful that at the end of this, when we meet tomorrow and then again in May, we will come towards some form of action plan that is grounded in equity and intersectionality of how we can integrate healthcare and social supports for newcomers in a way that is responsive and equitable. And that is the end of my presentation, and the floor is open. So I can just sort of facilitate the conversation myself if there are any questions. Do we have any questions online? Yeah, okay, I think there's a microphone there. Ogana, do you want to go first?
Yes. Okay. So we do have a question from the chat. The first question is, how did you compare to non-newcomers, either in your study or the literature?
Well, that's interesting. We didn't make a comparison. What we wanted to do was only do newcomers. And when we use the term newcomers, I should have said that earlier, we're using it as a very broad umbrella term for all possible migration pathways. So we're looking at undocumented, temporary, PR, economic, name it, refugee claimants, whether they were government, refugee claimants, and then government assisted and privately sponsored. But we didn't compare to non-newcomers because that was not the idea. The idea was then to look at within that big bucket, what were the factors that shaped their experiences of care? How was it different or similar? Yeah. Jay, did you have a question before we go back?
I do. Yeah. Should I go ahead?
Yeah, and then we'll go back to chat.
Okay, great. Thanks for that overview. You know, such great work, such an important project. I guess hearing this sort of overview, I reflect on like the number of different kinds of changes that are necessary here. Like there needs to be changes in broader public understanding in an anti-oppressive direction. There needs to be changes in the administration of this immigration system, changes in the coordination of health and social care. And I guess as you've been in this work and been sort of moving this work forward, is there a way that you've come to think about, like, it seems to me that there's an organization and management challenge here as well, you know, and a policy challenge. And is there a way you've come to sort out, like, what kinds of work to support, what kinds of changes to support yet? I mean, perhaps that's our shared task together, but.
I think that is actually it, because like when we're going through the data and having conversations, and when we finish, we went to share back to the organizations. It's like, whew, this is a huge, huge problem. And so that is actually the rationale for these things. It's like, it's not one person to solve alone. And I think it's also that if we're not doing this collaboratively, there's a risk that you move in one direction and you lose track of the impact on other parts of the system. So that's what we're hoping that through these conversations we will do, is to be able to get a better picture of this big complex issue and come to some understanding of, okay, what are the changes that are needed? Which ones can we tackle as community organizers or scholars, academics, researchers, policy advocates, whatever it is? What can't we tackle that we can then push on and say, okay, this is a problem that's recognized, but we can't handle it, so then government or policymakers need to take charge of it. I don't have the answers, but I'm hoping that this dialogues will help us get there. Thanks, Jay.
Thank you.
Ogana?
Yeah, so there are lots of comments about how it's been an excellent presentation, but we do have a question about how was compassionate care defined in this study?
Very good question. So when we were conceptualizing the proposal, we went to a widely accepted definition of compassionate care, which is the fact that you're able to recognize that somebody is going through something challenging or has a specific need. You're able to empathize with them, but it doesn't stop there. You're able to do whatever it takes to be able to alleviate their suffering. So that's a very rephrased way. However, we didn't want to narrow newcomers' experiences or the way in which they were describing their own expectations or how they would define compassionate care. So one of the questions we did ask as part of the interviews is, and I'm trying to remember the way we phrased it. It was something like, when you go and see a healthcare provider, what is it that you're really hoping they will do in a way that will make you feel comfortable and listened to? And they used many words, and I'll say some of the things that struck the most. It was that, I want them to meet me where I am at. And that will change over time, right? So the way I want you to be compassionate now that I just got to Canada is going to be different the way I want you to be compassionate down the line. The second thing is we did hear this sense of listening. And we found that it came from people who were within the bucket of newcomers who were most at risk of discrimination, said that in having interactions with care providers, they were experiencing gaslighting, where they were not believed. One person particularly said she's had a chronic condition for years before she came to Canada. She knew the diagnosis, she knows her symptoms, is a very good advocate for herself, but is a lawyer from a Middle Eastern country. And she was trying to explain to the provider, and the provider was like, no, I need you to go run some more tests. I'm not really sure that that's what's wrong with you. And she could tell that she was just being disbelieved because she's a female Middle Eastern, but it doesn't matter that she's a lawyer. It doesn't matter that she knows her disease. So she was like, I just want my provider to listen to me. For some, compassion was being seen. It was almost as if they could tell when the provider was putting them in a box, and they did not want that. They wanted to feel seen. I think those are the things that struck out to me as how they define compassionate care. So what we've learned is that it has evolved, and I think more importantly that it is not a one-time definition, is that how people, it's a shared expectation, and so you constantly have to negotiate am I being compassionate in this light? What do I need to do? Do I need to switch? Do I need to listen more? Do I need to be more intentional? I should add, though, just to wrap up my answer, is that when it came to technology and virtual care, providers said to us that when you had a previous relationship with the patient and you've had one-to-one interactions with them, you kind of established a baseline, consciously, unconsciously, about who that person is. So when you're talking with them on the phone, it's easy. If they pause, you know how to probe. But if it's a first-time encounter, you don't know this person, first intake, the person just got to Canada, 3 months ago, you're the first physician they're seeing. When they pause, the provider is not sure, should I probe? Would that be sensitive? Would I be too intrusive? If they hear a sigh, the tone of voice, they don't know if that's their normal. So they're not really sure of the questions to ask. And one of the things we generally found was, if people who were very clear, highly educated, language or technology-wise, who knew what they wanted to get from the virtual encounter, they were able to do it easily, and that was compassionate for them, because you were not forcing them to be in an in-person appointment when they wanted to be somewhere else. But for those who wanted in-person appointment and who needed to have that, I want you to look into my eyes, they wanted to know that that option was available for them. So I guess that opportunity of choice of how they experience healthcare or how the provider interacted with them was something that was also considered compassionate. Thank you for that question. Another question, Denise?
Thank you for a really, really interesting presentation, and lots of ideas are marinating right now, and I look forward to having more discussion about it. But one thing that struck me, and I'm curious about, is because I'm really interested in visibility and how we read bodies and how bodies are read. So did you notice did people talk about the difference between having a video call and a phone call? Because, and I have to say this as an aside, is that I hadn't seen my physician in Ottawa for 4 years. And I was told that they would only be paid if it was a video call and not a phone call. And so sometimes, like the clinic she worked at has a video system, and when it failed, and she ended up calling me, she made it very clear that she was not being paid for this encounter, even though it was the technology that was the problem. And so I was wondering if you heard that from the providers as well. But really, I'm interested in the difference, if there were any, between video and phone calls.
Yes, thank you so much, Denise, for that question. We did. It was part of the Pandora's box. We actually did ask which modality they got. And when we started the interviews, we were talking to patients first, and it was phone. And we started wondering, well, didn't they have any other options? And then we talked to providers, and providers said, in theory, there was the video option and the phone option. And when they started, it was like, okay, at least with video, I can see you, and so it should be easier, right? But then it wasn't, because there'll be a connection problem. And then the person was not in a space where they could put on their video, or they needed to get data that they couldn't afford to have the video on, or they were in transit while they were taking the call. And then even for the providers, it was frustrating, because you will send an email to say your appointment is at 1 p.m., this is a link to connect. You think the person got it, you're waiting on the call, they probably didn't get it, then you follow up with a phone call, oh, I got it, I just can't find the link, and then they're looking for the link, and then they connect. And then you need the interpreter to come in. And so by the time you do all of that, you have 30 minutes, 20 minutes are gone. And then you have 10 minutes to rush through the thing. So we did see that the providers, and I think patients, happily transitioned to phone just for everybody's sanity. However, they did say that video allowed there to be more relationship, because you could see people. It just was technologically wonky to get through. So that was what we heard. Yes, so here they paid, Jay, maybe you can speak to this, but I think what we had then was video was paid more than phone, but it was still reasonably reimbursed. Like telephones were still reasonably reimbursed. And what we actually saw was that phone was the most used overall.
I think up until 2022, they were reimbursed at the same rate.
Yeah.
And then there was a change.
Yes. So now there's a change such that video is more, And you can only use it if you've seen that patient at least once in the last 6 months, I believe, for you to be fully reimbursed, because they wanted to be sure that there was continuity of care and it wasn't just being used for episodic encounters. Yeah. Nancy, did you have a question?
Oh, I have lots. Just a quick comment.
Here's Mike.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ibukun. This is, so rich, but I had a comment about the notion of you privileged housing as a key determinant of well-being and health. And I was just wondering, because I'm not as familiar with the refugee shelters that you talked about, and in your journey mapping, you sort of tried to show that health or access came, it was a long journey toward that. And I'm just wondering if the refugee shelters, if, because I don't know much about them, do they have an opportunity to have built-in sort of a primary care or video or anything like that within the shelters themselves? I'm thinking kind of harm reduction, or along harm reduction lines, where for other population groups, that model seems to have worked, especially around the notion of fear and access. And so has any movement been made towards sort of
In-house.
Yeah.
care. So I don't want to get ahead of myself, because I know Vanessa is speaking on this tomorrow, but I will say, so not all refugee shelters will offer you the opportunity to get a primary care appointment. Some shelters have connections to primary care physicians, either a standard clinic where the physician will come in once a week or whatever schedule, or they will connect you to go to that point for care. I do not know of any shelters that have like a point. There are? Okay. And Vanessa is going to speak about it tomorrow. So I will not get ahead of it. I've sneaked at her slides. That's why I know she's going to speak about it. So I will leave her as the expert to talk on that tomorrow. So question being tabled for tomorrow. Vanessa's first question tomorrow. Cheat sheet. Any other questions? Yes, please. Demilade.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. You mentioned how a root cause analysis is very important in analyzing the situation with new migrants. However, the data isn't new, and it's something that has been present for so long. So I was just wondering what you think are some of like the limiting factors that prevent an analysis from this root cause perspective, as opposed to what you mentioned, like watering the branches.
Yes. I feel like you were listening to Nancy and I share our frustrations over lunch. Unfortunately, you are correct. It's like, this is not new. We know about this. Why are we or somebody else not doing something about it? And I think it boils down to what we prioritize as important as a society and what the government prioritizes to be important. Because if you are a certain group of people, then your problems may not be as important to be solved for, because they can argue that there's many other problems, right? It's like when Anna was saying that she was having a conversation and she was like, well, why are you not doing this? And they're like, well, we can't do everything. So the rational excuse, at least politically and policy-wise, has been we can't do everything. But I don't think that that is actually the explanation. I think it's that we have decided to deprioritize certain groups of people because we don't feel that their lives are valuable, and that's why it's not an important problem. If you think about it, if COVID had happened in only some countries, nothing would have happened in the world. But it became a problem because it affected people who held power. And if something touches those who hold power, economically, livelihood, whatever it is, it will get solved. But if there's a problem for people who have no power, and power has historically refused to be shared with them, then those problems don't matter. And that's part of why we need to take an equity and social justice lens to this, because even though we have this Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we're not living up to the expectations of those rights and freedoms. But very good question. Hanan? There's a mic.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. It really clarifies a lot of stuff which is related to many healthcare issues. My point is, I think it's related to the previous point, which is social determinants of health, which is the roots of any problem, of any healthcare problem, where it is available anywhere. So usually the focus on the downstream, where the illnesses, where the hospitals, where the healthcare providers, but the focus on the upstream is usually very little or negligible or ignored. Yeah. I don't know, you can put a lot of words on that. So the point here, I don't know where the approach should be. Is it by the system where the healthcare providers, if they are providing a holistic approach to any person, to any patient, they will know their social determinants of health. Mm-hmm. So as usually, the people or the patients are treated like a box of disease rather than a person. Mm-hmm. Because if the healthcare provider has this holistic approach and understood the patient's social determinants of health, this will solve a big portion of the problem. Yeah. Because it's mainly from there that if I got a mental problem because of a lot of issues of my important social determinants of health that are not well, then my mental health will be affected, then my depression, then my hypertension, mm-hmm. then the poor diabetes, and you can go through a long list of diseases. Yeah. So the approach not only be by the system, it should be also by the healthcare providers. And both of them should work together. I don't know where the system can put this in. And a lot of studies has been done about social determinants of health, but again, which is the upstream of these problems. Yeah. But usually the focus on the downstream, which is, we are going in a vicious circle, because when the load comes on this downstream more, then you have, you are draining all your resources mm-hmm. in the downstream, yeah. where if you put a little bit focus on the upstream, yeah. that drain will stop at some point, exactly. Which is logic, but yeah. I don't know where is the problem with the system.
I feel like your comment really captures the sort of things that we want to bring out through this conversation. So the way I see it, and thank you so much for that thoughtful remark, I feel like we've been blaming things on an individual level for too long, because it's like somebody needs to pass the buck or pass the blame. And so it's like, oh, the problem is the healthcare providers. When we're analyzing the data, and we used to have weekly reflection meetings as a research team, one of the things we did recognize is what we are seeing could be much worse if we did not have specific refugee-serving organizations, because many, if not all of them, have staff and their approach is very grounded in social determinants of health. Like, they provide culturally safe, trauma-informed approach that really looks at the person as a whole. But there are not that many refugee-serving organizations or settlement service organizations. And so what happens is they take as many as they can take, but there's a higher demand than there is a supply. So those who are still seeking care then end up in the emergency department or a walk-in clinic, where the context of care is not tailored for their needs, right? It's people who serve the general population, and so they look at you and they're like, okay, you're gonna waste my time. So they then get exposed to trauma. One way we could solve for it is to say, okay, we're going to train everybody so that all healthcare organizations will have staff that are trained in social determinants of health and can serve newcomers, or provide culturally safe care, which I think is something that needs to be done anyway, whether they're a newcomer or not, because the world, Canada is increasingly global. We're very, at least in Toronto and Ontario, we're very ethnically diverse. But to your point, if we solved upstream, then we will stop the bleeding downstream, and then we can make use of our resources more efficiently. And I think that's where we need to go, taking a more upstream level approach, taking a more collaborative approach, but just skipping this idea of blaming and saying, oh, the provider needs to go for more training, because it's not really the more training that is the problem, if you get what I mean. Okay, I think we can take one more question, because I'm really so keen to keep my promise. Is there any last questions, remarks, contributions? Because it doesn't have to be a question as well. It could just be a contribution to the conversation, because we're trying to harvest those as well. Okay. Yes, please.
I think the point of using an intersectionality framework is exactly that. It's really hard to actually apply intersectionality, and that's been the critic. But on the other hand, it's about political and structural intersectionality, meaning you have to work up and down at the same time. And I think that's what she means about a multi-strand approach.
Yeah. And I don't think there's nobody has figured out the perfect way of doing it. It's that we're learning as we go along. So you do read of some interventions where they've tried to do it this way, but they've not gone all the way for multiple reasons. Some of which is that a good intervention starts getting rolled out because they get funding, but then that funding ends in like 12 months or 18 months. And so your ability to learn from it and reinforce the learnings to actually actualize the change gets truncated. And then you wait for a new programmatic funding cycle. And that's something that settlement organizations constantly have to struggle with as well. Thank you, Nancy. So in closing, thank you for such a wonderful day. Your engagement, your presence, your time, your contributions, generosity of very supportive and encouraging remarks. We will resume our dialogues tomorrow, same place, same time, same location. If you're joining in person, you're welcome. I think there are some people who we expected to come in person and have decided to join online. If you won't be able to make it in person, please cancel so that more people can come in, because we did have some last-minute requests to show up, but we're worried that that would mean that we couldn't offer lunch to people. So we're looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. Have a wonderful evening. Stay safe and enjoy the solar eclipse. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.